There was darkness on the dark streets of the city and alleys, and the loudspeaker was broadcasting news that could shock anyone. While the next bloody victim gave up his last breath, the news talked about 176 corpses that were killed in one way, by sucking the blood. Nobody knows when it started, but everyone is sure that this is just the beginning. The TV presenter is trying to convince people that the government has everything under control, but the maniacs are too strong and insidious. Meanwhile, the two men were relaxing culturally in the bar and conducting dialogues about their love affairs. One of the friends kept trying to boast of his successes and dominance in bed, and the other agreed with him. The amount of alcohol in the blood of one of the friends began to go off scale, and he, in a very rude manner, began to ask the waiter to pour him some more whiskey. The waiter tried to soften the situation, to which he received a threat about his possible dismissal. The two men did not know that such behavior towards a harmless waiter could be fatal for them. After just one moment, they saw fangs protruding from the mouth and scarlet eyes full of rage, ready to tear them into small pieces. In an instant, the vampire rushed at them with indescribable speed, wanting to tear each of them into small pieces. At that very second, fear and a feeling of despair forced them to run as fast as they could in the hope that someone would save them. The vampire began to greedily tear them apart, sucking out every last drop. And it seemed that nothing could save the poor people from such a sad fate, when suddenly a shot rang out. On the street, there was a tall man with bright burgundy hair, dressed in a black waterproof raincoat with raindrops flowing down it, and it was he who fired the shot. The vampire immediately rushed at him, anticipating easy prey in addition to his already completed dinner. The wound received from the shot made itself felt. It greatly weakened the vampire, but did not shake his confidence in his victory over his opponent. But all the vampire's hopes of an easy win were destroyed in an instant. The man finished off this bloodsucker with a lightning strike. At the end of this short battle, he was the only one standing in the pouring rain. This world is filled with vampires, but the main bloodsucker does not have his own shell. He can be anyone. The man in the cloak turns out to be a hunter of these creatures. His goal is to rid this world of all evil spirits. Meanwhile, in one of the hospitals, nurses are discussing the next victims, saying that bloodsuckers cannot be killed due to their too fast regeneration. They discuss the news that said that every 30,000 people are vampires. Suddenly, their conversation is interrupted by a tall, stately, and very attractive girl with pink hair, talking about their careless attitude to work. This pink-haired girl turns out to be the head nurse, and she is informed that several bags of donor blood are missing. She decides to lightly scold her subordinates, thinking that they have once again mixed up something. After which she says that her shift has already ended. They must sort out the missing donor blood themselves. This girl's name is Jessica, and she is the head nurse in the blood transfusion department at the local city hospital. The nurses discuss Jessica, saying what a strong and independent woman she is, who manages to raise 2 children while alone. Jessica understands how others treat her without knowing that she is keeping a very important secret. As she leaves the hospital, Jessica is greeted by her children, a little boy and a girl, who run into her arms. While the little and sweet girl runs into her mother's arms, the boy stands and says that their mother is late. After the boy expressed his dissatisfaction, he emphasizes that he was very upset and offended by his mother. Jessica, realizing that she is slightly guilty in front of her children, tries to laugh it off with a grin, pretending that nothing happened. Jessica grabs her children in her arms and hugs them very tightly, and suggests we go to their favorite ice cream store. The teacher standing behind Jessica is trying to make a joke by saying that she might have a man. Jessica's son sharply tries to object, saying that his mother has no one, and suggests that the teacher introduce her to someone. Jessica, feeling awkward, tries to shut her son's mouth, saying that they should listen to him less. The teacher praises Jessica's daughter, saying that she was unusually good today and behaved very quietly and calmly. Jessica is sure that with age, her daughter will loosen up and become very active thanks to the teacher for the work done. Before saying goodbye, the teacher warns Jessica about the situation in the city related to vampires. Suddenly, a little boy stumbles behind them and the teacher immediately runs to help him. Jessica's children's eyes suddenly turn red when they see the boy's bloody knees. Jessica manages to react to this situation and understands that she needs to leave as soon as possible. She grabs her children in her arms and quickly leaves while saying goodbye to the teacher. Jessica hurries away, telling her children to be patient a little longer. Jessica's daughter cannot restrain herself and, breaking free, sharply waves her hands. There is a sharp flash of light and a powerful explosion from which pieces of asphalt fly in different directions. A deep crater remains at the site of the explosion, and Jessica understands that she needs to leave here as soon as possible. Jessica runs to her car, trying to get her children into it as quickly as possible. Jessica's main secret is that her children are vampires. Moments from 5 years ago emerge in her memory, in which she makes love with a certain man. She has practically no memories of that night. She doesn't remember his face, his name, or what happened to her. All that will remind her is condemning glances in her direction, eternal mockery, and reproaches regarding her children. Despite all this, she continued to move forward alone, raising her son and daughter without a father. Remembering her children's birthday, she sees only darkness and a huge number of bats hovering over the hospital. Everyone around said that this was a very bad sign, and that a sad future awaited her son and daughter. It seemed to Jessica that all these mice were protecting her. She understood that she could never leave her children to their fate. When she saw her newborn son and daughter, she realized that they had become the meaning of life for her. Trying to touch her daughter for the first time, she immediately bit her finger and blood sprayed out. Jessica, with horror in her eyes, pulled her hand back in bewilderment. She was immediately paralyzed by fear and misunderstanding. After getting her son and daughter into the car, Jessica checks to see if everything is okay with them. Jessica's son is indignant that she is stupid and worries too much about them. With a slight ironic smile, Jessica lightly hits her son and tells him not to dare to be rude to her. Jessica's son tells her that she taught them to always restrain themselves and control their powers. Jessica thinks about why her son Connor copes with everything so much easier than her daughter Daisy, because her strength is growing every day. Jessica says that Daisy is great and offers to buy her favorite ice cream. Connor immediately intervenes in the conversation, saying that he also wants ice cream and his mother promised to buy it for both of them. Jessica says Connor needs to take better care of his teeth because he has a lot of tooth decay. Connor and Daisy, together from the very cradle, are real brother and sister who help each other. Jessica wants to do her best to maintain order and peace in her family, thinking about how to protect her children. Jessica is informed by phone that she urgently needs to return to the hospital and help with the operation. There is a woman in the hospital with a disfigured left side of her face who is crying and screaming in pain. Doctors immediately try to take the girl to the operating room as her life hangs by a thread. A young doctor in a snow-white coat is trying to calm the nurses and take the situation into his own hands. The nurse says that Dr. Kevin needs to hurry and gives him the patient's medical record. Jessica appears and says that a vampire is involved in this, judging by the wound left on the woman's body. The nurse says that the man saved the woman and managed to bring her to the operating room by pointing his finger at him. Jessica doesn't see any man and asks if she's sure he was here. Dr. Kevin says that the operation must be started immediately, otherwise the victim's life will no longer be saved. Everyone present agrees with the doctor and rushes to take the victim to the operating room as soon as possible. Not far from the patient's bed, the nurse notices a document lying on the floor. This turns out to be the ID of the same man who managed to save the victim. It states that he is a vampire hunter. The nurse is shocked, saying that she's never seen anything like this before in her life. Jessica worries about her children left in the car, who should never be discovered. Jessica rips off her robe, giving it to the nurse, and says that she urgently needs to go somewhere. Jessica runs to help her children because they are the most important thing in her life. Dr. Kevin tries to stop her, saying that they will have a difficult operation. Jessica opens the car door and does not see Connor and Daisy, who have disappeared somewhere. Connor and Daisy are standing near a candy machine, and next to them is a tall man in a black raincoat. Daisy says she wants to eat, and Connor tries to convince her to get back into the car because Mom will be very worried. Connor counts his pocket money and realizes that he doesn't have enough for anything. Suddenly, a woman inserts a coin into the machine and says that she will pay for them. This adult woman turns out to be the mother of a friend of their classmate from kindergarten with whom they are friends. The woman asks Connor and Daisy where their mom and dad are and why they are alone at such a dangerous time. Connor and Daisy's friend interrupts his mom and says that they don't have a dad and he's never seen him. A friend's mother tells him to shut up and that he shouldn't say such things because they could offend someone. An adventurous idea is born in Connor's head, and he looks intently at the man standing behind them. Connor rushes towards the tall man, grabbing his leg and saying that he is their father. A man standing calmly and drinking soda does not understand what is happening and what is the matter. Connor points his hand at the man in the raincoat and says that he is their father, showing his confidence with all his appearance. The man is clearly dissatisfied with this behavior, as a result of which veins begin to appear on his face and neck. Connor stands and tries to convince his friend that this is their real dad by telling a fictitious story, after which he grabs him by the leg, feigning pity, and offers to call a doctor, assuring him that Dad is clearly not feeling well. Jessica runs throughout the hospital and tries to find her children, interviewing the nurses she comes across, one of whom says that she saw them in her office with some man. Jessica immediately runs towards her office, fearing that something might happen to her children. She stands in complete bewilderment, trying to figure out what is going on here, seeing in front of her sleeping son and daughter in an embrace with that same man. The stranger does not have time to say a word when Connor immediately interrupts him in the hope that his lie will not be discovered. The man immediately stands up, looking straight at Jessica and asking how she could lose her children, after which he hands her Daisy and Connor and hurries to leave here as quickly as possible to do his own business. The stranger warns Jessica to watch her children better, or they might get into trouble. Jessica sits down on the sofa to catch her breath and calm her heartbeat after such stress. Dr. Kevin comes into the office and asks Jessica what happened and why she ran away at such an inopportune moment. Connor and Daisy hug Dr. Kevin, with whom they clearly have a good relationship. Connor tells the doctor about the situation, trying to convince him that he has a father. Dr. Kevin agrees with him and asks if Jessica has a boyfriend. Connor tries to laugh it off by presenting the situation in such a way that all this was done for the sake of his mother and her future. Jessica decides to ask the doctor about the fact that bags of blood have recently started disappearing. The doctor says that he has not heard anything about this, but will definitely try to understand the current situation. After everything that happened, Jessica takes her children, says goodbye to the doctor, and tries to leave the hospital building as soon as possible. Jessica says that Connor and Daisy should not have run away because she was very worried about them and also forbade calling any strangers their father. Jessica says that strangers can be dangerous and they need to stay away from those who could harm them. Connor says that he didn't really like the stranger. His eyes were too angry and his voice was very rude. Connor believes that Dr. Kevin is the best candidate for a husband for his mother, listing all his qualities and advantages. Connor fantasizes and imagines what a wonderful couple Jessica and Kevin would be. They immediately grab him by the cheeks, saying that they are adults and will be able to sort out their feelings themselves. Meanwhile, police officers are conducting an investigation into the missing child. That same stranger and his colleague question the teacher for clues and evidence that will help them in the investigation. The teacher says that she is just a trainee and does not have a lot of knowledge and information. The employee tries to calm the woman down, saying that this is not the first time this has happened, and the fact that a vampire is here has not been confirmed. The teacher says that she does not believe what is happening, horrified by the fact that ordinary children can become victims of vampires. She tries to blame herself for everything that happened, citing her negligence and inattention. The employee says that they will conduct the interview another time when her emotional state has stabilized. Through the glass overlooking the kindergarten courtyard, a stranger notices the same girl he met in the hospital. For a second, he thinks that such coincidences are not at all accidental, and for a moment he loses concentration. A second later, Connor appears and again decides to make fun of him, trying to make him out to be their father once again. The stranger is very surprised by what happened, noticing that this world is really small. Daisy worries that she offended her uncle with her behavior, although he was so kind to her and bought her ice cream. Connor tells Daisy to stay away from the stranger because Mom strictly forbade approaching suspicious people. Daisy says that she does not consider him bad and forbids Connor to boss her around because he is only 10 minutes older. Meanwhile, the teacher approaches Connor and Daisy, surprised that they are still here. The teacher asks if she and her brother had a fight, to which Daisy replies that she hates him and that he is a stupid mischief. After which Daisy runs away, and the teacher tries to calm Connor down and says that she will follow her and nothing bad will happen. Meanwhile, at the police station, they say that part of the body of the missing child has been found. At the crime scene, a strange gadget was found in the hand of a child, and no one knows what it is. The stranger abruptly gets up from his chair and says that he needs to go back to kindergarten. On the way, he says that he found information about the teacher. Her name and identity are fictitious, and in the elementary school where she worked before there is also a missing student. The current situation begins to become more and more dangerous, anticipating bad consequences. Daisy, hiding in the toilet, thinks that she is strange and very different from other children. The teacher says that there is nothing to worry about and we are all different in our own way. There is no need to be afraid of this. The teacher turns out to be a vampire who is going to suck every last drop of blood from a little defenseless girl. At that same second, the same stranger appears, part-time a vampire hunter. The vampire suddenly rushes at the hunter, surprising him at her enormous speed. The hunter understands that the purple color of the eyes signals the strength of a vampire who belongs to a noble family, whose hobby is drinking the blood of children, which increases their strength and speed. The hunter manages to tell Daisy to hide in the booth and not open her eyes until he gives her permission. Having received a serious wound, the hunter begins to bleed, and the vampire rejoices at yet another victim. Meanwhile, Jessica meets Connor and wonders where his sister went. The vampire says that all the little people are pathetic and weak, good only as food. The hunter understands that the vampire is stronger than him, and in his condition he cannot cope with her. At the same second, an unexpected shot occurs, piercing the vampire's head right through. Jessica, who suddenly appeared, managed to grab the pistol lying on the ground and shoot the vampire straight in the head. Everyone in the room has time to catch their breath. Daisy leaves the booth thinking that everything is already over. Connor rushes into Daisy's arms, glad that nothing happened to her and that she is safe and sound. One shot turns out to be not enough for the vampire. She jumps up, trying to attack her victims once again. The hunter tries to protect Jessica by ordering her to grab the children and get out of here. The vampire quickly approaches the hunter, already preparing to pierce his decrepit, bleeding body. A moment before the blow, the vampire grabs her face with her hands and begins to scream furiously in pain. Connor grabs a fragment of the mirror and directs a ray of sunlight directly into the vampire's face. The hunter says that even the most powerful vampires are most afraid of direct sunlight. In just a second, the vampire's body begins to lose strength, turning into pieces of ash. Meanwhile, police officers arrived and came to the aid of the victims and their colleague. The hunter's partner praises little Connor, emphasizing his ingenuity and help in hunting vampires. The hunter says that they are lucky because some vampires have the ability to resist the rays of sunlight because they are descendants of vampire people. The stranger asks Jessica where she learned to shoot and handle weapons like that. Daisy says that her uncle was injured because he was protecting her and he needs medical attention. The hunter's partner knows that Jessica is a nurse asking him to help and treat his wound. The hunter tries to get out of it, saying that he doesn't need help and he won't suffer from a simple scratch. The assistant hunter takes the children and leaves Jessica alone with him, asking him not to rush. Jessica remains with the wounded hunter, realizing that the situation is hopeless and he will have to treat his wounds. The hunter's face shows slight embarrassment after Jessica asks him to take off his clothes. He once again says that he doesn't need her help and it's just a scratch. Jessica says that he has no need to be shy because she is a doctor and he doesn't need to act like a little child. Jessica takes off his clothes and sits him on the sofa, telling him not to move and to sit. A moment later, Jessica notices the number of scars on his body, realizing that this is not the first time he has fought vampires. The hunter again tries to squeeze out the remnants of courage by pretending that he is fine and does not need help. Jessica again begins to insist on her point, saying that this is dangerous and he may develop blood poisoning. She begins to treat his wound with surgical precision and hears his heartbeat quicken. The hunter thanks Jessica and hurries to leave quickly after the first aid provided to him. Finally, he says that he will definitely go to the hospital after he has dealt with all the matters. Looking after him, Jessica once again thinks about what he had to go through, that there were so many scars on his body. Meanwhile, the vampire hunter goes into a dark alley where he meets a mysterious masked man and grabs his hand. This stranger turns out to be Dr. Kevin and says that he has nothing to worry about. The vampire hunter asks why Kevin is here again because he promised not to come to him anymore. Dr. Kevin is the one who steals donated blood from the hospital and gives it to the vampire hunter. Kevin knows that if a vampire hunter doesn't drink fresh human blood for a long time, his life could be in danger. The hunter says that Kevin should not worry about his life because if something happens, he will kill him first. Kevin says that the hunter is different from all these monsters and that he shouldn't worry because he won't tell anyone the secret of his identity. The hunter warns that all those who died from vampires were too naive and believed in the harmless and kind appearance of other people. The hunter's body begins to change. Fangs and claws grow on his hands, his eyes turn red, and his hair becomes ashen. The hunter rushes towards Kevin, intending to make a lightning strike, but stops at the last moment. After which the hunter takes on his previous appearance, turns around and says that he will leave Kevin alive. As he leaves, he says that blood of type 0 will taste sweeter and more pleasant. Meanwhile, disturbances related to her children continue to occur in Jessica's apartment. Connor and Daisy once again hung upside down like bats. Jessica tries to get Connor and Daisy to go to bed instead of hanging upside down from the ceiling. Jessica takes Connor and Daisy to her bed and promises to read them their favorite story. Connor, unlike Daisy, prefers to read more adult books, claiming that fairy tales are for little ones. He says that reading fairy tales is boring and pointless because everything they say is actually made up. At this moment, Daisy is very scared from hearing the words that fairy tales are actually made up, and Jessica immediately tries to calm her down. Jessica picks up the book that Connor is reading. It turns out to be an encyclopedia about vampires. Daisy is very worried and asks her mother if she and her brother will become as evil and dangerous as their teacher was. Connor is also alarmed by Daisy's words, and he decides to ask his mother a couple of leading questions. Jessica reassures her children by saying that they are the most wonderful and sweetest kids on the planet, who should not compare themselves to some terrible monsters. For a second, the thought that they would become real vampires slipped into each of their heads. Meanwhile, the vampire hunter receives a call from his assistant and says that due to recent events, the authorities have decided to change his place of residence. The assistant reports that all the necessary preparations have already been made, and he has personally dealt with this issue. The fighter against evil spirits does not really like this idea, but after thinking it over carefully, he still agrees with the authorities and begins to pack his things. After some time, the hunter gets to his new apartment, the number of which he cannot remember, wandering between number 2 and 4. I'm trying to call my assistant, who is now temporarily unavailable. He realizes that he forgot the code for the door. But nevertheless, attempts to penetrate into the apartment were crowned with success, and the interior of the apartment did not cause much delight in our hero. He says that this is the least of his worries at the moment, and all he wants is to take a shower as soon as possible. Standing in the shower, our hero thinks about whether he broke into someone else's apartment, once again remembering that the handle he pulled and the room behind it simply turned out to be empty. Immediately opening the door, a small white toy with red horns and black wings falls into his hands. He again remembers his assistant who promised him to personally design his new apartment. The hunter also remembers Jessica again, and the incident that happened with him and her children. To his surprise, he also discovers baby soap in the shape of a duckling standing in the shower. Deciding that this is just a coincidence and there is nothing strange about it, because all this is the work of his colleague. Meanwhile, Jessica returns home, rushing to take a shower as soon as possible. Entering the bathroom, she freezes and stands in confusion, seeing a naked man in front of her. After a few seconds of confusion, she can't think of anything better than to scream out loud at the top of her voice. After some time, the hunter finds out from his assistant the exact number of his home, which turns out to be the neighboring apartment. Jessica tries to reprimand the uninvited guest for breaking into someone else's apartment. Jessica is trying to clarify how he got into someone else's apartment and why he washed himself with her son's shampoo. He tries to abruptly get up from the sofa, trying to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, but at that moment the towel falls off him. Jessica immediately tries to cover her face with her hands, making excuses that she didn't have time to see anything. At this moment, Dr. Kevin comes through the door and brought Jessica's children. Hunter tries to hide while Kevin reassures Jessica that the kids are fine and okay. Jessica is trying to find a way out of this situation by trying to push Dr. Kevin out the door. Kevin asks Jessica to let him stay because he is incredibly thirsty. Our uninvited guest hears Jessica struggling to find an excuse for why she can't let him stay. Meanwhile, Connor and Daisy discover the hunter trying to gather his things. Connor immediately tries to ask his mother why she hid a half-naked man from them in the apartment. Connor is clearly unhappy with the current situation and is trying to find out what happened here. The vampire hunter says that his name is Christopher, and now he will live next door to them. The hunter tries to shut up Connor by saying that he will buy him 10 new bottles of the same kind. Meanwhile, Daisy walks around the stranger from behind and hugs him from behind, looking intently into his eyes. Giv once again tries to convince his brother that his uncle is very good and shouldn't be afraid of him, because it was he who saved their vampire attacks. Jessica is amazed by the situation and is unable to understand why the children treat him so well. Although Connor has calmed down, he still has not fully forgiven his mother for the situation. Jessica tries to prove that she is not to blame for anything, and so that he stops scolding her, and asks Connor to apologize to Christopher. Returning to his apartment, our hero takes out a strange black suitcase that is clearly best not seen by anyone. Inside the suitcase there is a pistol, a cross on a chain, a book, 4 ampoules, and some strange gadget similar to the one they found in the hand of one of the victims. Taking a gun in his hand, he thinks about whether something bad or terrible will happen. In the middle of the night, Christopher suddenly wakes up, grabbing a gun in his hand and preparing to defend himself. He notices that something is rustling under his blanket, as if it is about to attack him and suck out all the blood. Raising the edge of the blanket, he sees little Daisy, who ended up there inexplicably. Christopher is trying to figure out how the little girl managed to sneak into his apartment at night. He stops looking for excuses for the current situation while looking at the cute sleeping girl. The hunter decides to take little Daisy to her mother and at the same time find out how this could happen. Jessica explains that her daughter sleepwalks quite often and it started from early childhood. She tries to take her daughter in her arms, causing her to start crying and struggling. Jessica says she'll get angry if Daisy doesn't listen to her and won't go to bed right away. Christopher asks to be given the opportunity to calm Daisy and begins to rock her in his arms. At this moment, Jessica is shocked that such a seemingly rude man gets along so well with children. The hunter says that he put Daisy to bed and will stay overnight in the living room in order to avoid such an incident, warning Jessica that she should not touch anything in his apartment, especially under the pillow. Having finally figured out the current situation, Christopher goes to bed in the living room on a small sofa. Lying in bed, Jessica remembers the hunter's words not to touch anything, especially under the pillow. Reaching out her hand, she discovers a black, loaded pistol with the safety on. At that very second, she remembers that she must not forget who he is and who he works for. Jessica begins to worry that the hunter might harm her children or even kill them. After some time, Christopher finds himself on a mission to exterminate vampires. One of the bloodsuckers rushes at the hunter, saying that the pathetic people cannot defeat them. The vampire is about to sink his fangs into the hunter's neck with the desire to drink the warm and thick blood. At the same second, a powerful explosion occurs and the vampire remains lying on the ground. Christopher finds himself surrounded by several dozen more vampires who want to tear him into small pieces. Literally in a matter of seconds, he again takes on that same sinister form, his fangs grow and his hair turns ashen. The bloodsuckers at the same moment realize that in front of them is an unusual person, but a hybrid. The vampire hunter is about to send them all to hell with a burning rage in his eyes. After the battle, he calls a cleanup squad to remove all the corpses lying on the roof. Christopher says that each transformation takes a lot of energy from him, and he needs to find a place to catch his breath. In the window of a nearby building, he notices Jessica standing in front of the mirror and combing her hair. Without thinking twice, he bursts into her apartment through the window, breaking it into small pieces. He falls on Jessica, throwing her onto the bed, causing her to be shocked and unable to utter a single word. The vampire hunter is trying to find an excuse for the current situation and explain everything as clearly as possible. But before he has time to say a word, the last of his strength leaves his body and he passes out, dropping his head on the girl's shoulder. Connor's scream is heard from the next room, running into his mother's room because of the strange noise. Having opened the door, the boy thinks that her mother was attacked by some man and immediately tries to drive him away. Jessica decides to put Christopher on the bed while wondering what to do with him. She decides to give him first aid by bandaging his wounds and wiping the sweat from his face. After some time, the hunter still wakes up. I don't remember how he got here. Connor immediately tries to stand up for his mother, saying that Christopher attacked her and hit her. The hunter has not yet fully come to his senses, so he finds nothing better than to tell the boy to mind his own business. Our hero doesn't understand what's going on and asks why it's so cold in the apartment. After which Jessica explains to him that he broke into her room by breaking the window and did not even apologize for what happened. The victim also says that she did not call the police and he must return her money for the damage caused. After which she tries to figure out how he managed to break into her on the 19th floor through the window. Christopher tries to explain that many vampire cleanup operations involve helicopters. He's already about to leave. They say that the police will definitely compensate her for all the damage and fix the window. Jessica grabs his hand, saying that she is a nurse and cannot just let him leave in this state. She says he can stay for a while to recover. Meanwhile, Connor tries to do another dirty trick by pouring salt and pepper into our hero's coffee. Connor's mom immediately stops him, saying that he won't get away with such behavior and she will definitely punish him. Meanwhile, Daisy tries to show Christopher their old family photo album. The photographs show all stages of Jessica's life, from childhood to the present day. The The vampire hunter notices a strange coincidence. In all the photographs, Jessica is completely alone. After some time, Daisy's mother brings our hero a cup of coffee, asking what they are doing here. Looking at Daisy, Christopher thinks about the fact that he has never seen their father. Jessica understands what question is brewing in his head and says that they never had a father. At the same moment, a tense atmosphere hangs between her and the hunter. A girl playing with blocks does not notice how the tower she built begins to collapse. Mom immediately notices this and is trying with all her might to save her daughter from bruises and injuries. Christopher immediately rushes at her, shielding her with his body from the falling debris of the turret. For a few seconds, their gazes are frozen on each other, and their bodies do not move at all. Little Daisy grabs the hunter's head and pushes him towards her mother. Christopher and Jessica share a tender kiss, shocked by the situation. They start apologizing to each other, and little Daisy stands there and laughs. After some time, the brother and sister spend their time carefree at the amusement park. Their mother, sitting on a bench, once again replays that same kiss in her head and why everything turned out this way. She remembers herself as a little girl, trying to scroll through all the moments of her life in her head. Meanwhile, behind her, a man dressed as Mickey Mouse is trying to entertain the kids. Cheerful and small children try to shout out the correct answers to the riddles that Mickey tells them. Instead of having fun with other children, Daisy just stands and looks at it all from the side. A clown appears out of nowhere and introduces everyone around him to his vampire friends. He asks parents not to worry because this is just a special makeup and their children are not in danger. The kids cheerfully react to the current situation, anticipating fun games. People in vampire costumes with high-quality makeup begin to play with children, pretending to be real predators. One little boy freezes in horror, opening his eyes wide and looking at what is happening. With horror on his face, the boy says that he sees them, vampire fangs right in their mouths. All the animators present, parents and their children, look at the little boy with confusion. At the same time, panic begins to reign among people. Someone screams about the appearance of a real vampire. An adult woman stands in horror, trying with all her might to protect her little son from a terrible creature. The vampire grabs the child from the woman's hands and rushes in a completely different direction. The park begins to be evacuated, and Jessica and her children try to leave this place as soon as possible. The police immediately arrive at the scene to deal with this tragedy. Our main character, who is at the head of the anti-vampire department, orders the immediate evacuation of people and the cordoning off of the territory. The police quickly evacuate civilians and immediately close the park for further operations. A police officer reports that they combed the entire park, but could not find any traces of the vampire. The same woman whose child was kidnapped sits not far from the police car and cries. Christopher asks his assistant if there are any other victims among the park visitors. He manages to notice that the attacking vampires did not try to quench their thirst and only kidnapped one small child. While he is standing in thought, Jessica notices him and decides to ask him if everything will be okay. The vampire hunter tries to take her to a safe zone, saying that it is very dangerous to be here. Jessica interrupts him and says that she might know where the vampire is hiding and can show him the way. She leads him to an attraction in the form of a scary tunnel through which they need to go. Christopher decides to ask her why she suddenly decided that the vampire was hiding here. He says that he was mistaken in trusting her because her guess is very stupid and they are wasting their time. Jessica notices traces of blood on the tunnel floor and points out that a vampire was here. The vampire hunter decides to make sure it's really blood by licking it off Jessica's finger. The girl stands in shock, not knowing what to say to this prank, and Christopher apologizes, saying that this is a professional habit, after which he covers her mouth with his hand, telling her not to speak so loudly because of her they can be heard. They approach the tunnel exit, and our hero orders Jessica to stand behind him. Christopher tells Jessica not to move and that he won't hurt her anyway. Not far from the exit from the tunnel, they notice that same vampire holding a small child in his arms. The vampire sits on the ground with his back to our heroes, completely unaware of their presence. The vampire hunter assesses the situation, preparing to attack and trying to notice whether other individuals are nearby. Jessica notices that the vampire's gaze is very kind and he is not going to harm the little boy. The vampire's gaze was like that of a frightened mother who treasures the most valuable thing in her life. Christopher points his gun at the unsuspecting victim and prepares to shoot. At the last moment, Jessica manages to stop him, causing the bullet's trajectory to slightly change. The bullet hits the vampire's leg, leaving him bleeding helplessly on the ground. Approaching the vampire, he says that you shouldn't believe their tears, because they are very good at pretending to be ordinary people. Other police officers immediately arrive at the scene and surround the bloodsucker. One of the employees orders the vampire not to move by putting a gun to his head. One of the agents manages to tear off the mask from the vampire's face, and our heroes notice that this is an ordinary person. The person turns out to be an ordinary woman who blames the police for being useless. In hysterics, the woman screams that it was they who could not save her child. She asks Christopher why the other children survived, but her son had to die. Meanwhile, a huge crowd of reporters and journalists had gathered near the scene of the incident. The assistant to our main character reports that he managed to find information about that same woman. The report talks about an incident 2 years ago in which one child died after a vampire flood. Our heroes understand that this woman was the mother of this particular child who died 2 years ago. The report also states that the mother could not come to terms with the death of her child, and 6 months after the accident divorced her husband. Over time, she developed a mental disorder and subsequently decided to infiltrate an amusement park and pretend to be a vampire, kidnapping another child. She wanted to kill him so that his mother would feel the same pain that she herself felt. The assistant tells our main character that she fully confirms her words, and this was all her cunning plan. Meanwhile, the police detain the woman, planning to take her to the station for further proceedings. Walking past the vampire hunter, she meets his gaze and wants to tell him something. The woman is trying to escape from the hands of the police and rush at our main character. 1 second is enough for her to reach Christopher's face and hit him with her palm. She shouts to Christopher that she recognized him and asks him to return her child to her, blaming him for everything. The assistant of our main character is trying to calm the woman down by handcuffing her and trying to get her into the car. The vampire hunter understands the situation and orders her to be released and given a chance to speak. The woman again rushes at our protagonist, trying to accuse him of incompetence and that it was because of him that her son died. Christopher agrees with the words and says that it was a mistake on their part. Accumulated rage takes over the victim's body. She reaches out to the handle of the knife sticking out of her pocket. Grabbing the knife, with a lightning-fast movement, she manages to plunge it into the shoulder of our main character. Christopher realizes that he lost concentration and very stupidly allowed himself to be hurt. The woman wants to strike again, but Jessica manages to stop her. She tries to explain to the victim that she is also a mother and understands her feelings. Jessica manages to catch the criminal on the contradiction and the fact that she wanted to kill the child and still did not kill him. She says that she could not kill the kidnapped child because she remembered her dead child. This information shocks the criminal, causing the knife to fall out of her hands. Jessica tries to convince the woman that revenge will not bring her son back to life, and she needs to come to terms with the loss. She asks how then you differ from the vampires who killed your child. The woman, having lost her last strength, falls to her knees, saying that she will never be able to forgive them. The police officers finally pick up the woman and take her away, intending to take her to the station. Suddenly, from the crowd of reporters, little Daisy runs up to her mother and grabs her leg. Jessica decides to check with her daughter where her brother is, to which Daisy replies that he should be with his mother. After these words, everyone around them begins a quick search for Connor, because trouble could happen to him. Christopher notices the little rascal, wondering how he managed to get there. Connor, looking at him in response, tells him not to stand there like a pillar and to quickly get him out of here. Our main character sees how a little boy was able to cling to the edge of a booth on a Ferris wheel. Before helping the little boy, our main character decides to take a photo of him as a souvenir. Because of such an innocent and childish joke, little Connor begins to cry and scream that he is scared. After which, Christopher finally decides to help him by taking him off the Ferris wheel and putting him on his shoulders. Connor manages to notice that the hunter was wounded and traces of blood are visible on his white shirt. Christopher decides not to hesitate and take the frightened boy to his mother as soon as possible. Returning to the scene, the assistant reports that they were able to find a video camera that may contain evidence of today's incident. The hunter decides to personally verify the authenticity of this evidence and picks up a camera. In one of the photographs, he notices little Daisy standing all alone. The main character's assistant decides to take little Connor to his sister's car because they will be safe there. Jessica manages to notice the glowing red eyes in the photo of her daughter. She is afraid that Christopher will be able to unravel her secret and decides to kiss him right on the lips. Out of surprise, the camera falls out of his hands with a crash, falling onto the sidewalk tiles. From surprise, our main character does not immediately have time to come to his senses, but still gathers his strength. He pushes Jessica away. I don't understand why she did it, and for what purpose. Jessica herself decides to laugh it off and make up an incomprehensible story on the fly in order to justify her actions. After which, pointing at the camera, saying that it crashed from an impact from such a great height. She immediately grabs the camera. At the same time, I apologize for the inconvenience and says that she can repair it. Christopher is clearly unaware of Jessica's true intentions and what she is trying to hide by simply thinking that she is crazy. A vampire hunter calls the police department and asks for information on a certain person. The main character's assistant is very surprised looking at the screen and reading the information found. Looking at the information he found, Christopher remembers Jessica's childhood photo album, and he is surprised that she is always so cheerful despite what happened to her in the past. Meanwhile, the police arrived at a new crime scene, which looks very strange. One of the warehouse workers explains that the local authorities asked the vampire hunter to take on this case. It seems to the main character's assistant that the case does not pose any danger. They were called in just like that. The employee says that this time everything is different, and it is necessary for Mr. Christopher to personally take care of this matter. The main character understands that the warehouse employee is not deceiving him and decides to find out where the body is. On the floor, they see the pale body of a man in a suit, with a piece of white cloth lying on his face. The first impression tells employees that nothing serious has happened. A moment later, they notice a bat-shaped scar on the back of the victim's head. This sign was also found on the other two corpses discovered earlier, which indicates some kind of connection between them. At the last moment, Christopher's assistant notices another important detail. The victim's right hand is nailed to the floor, and there is a note underneath it. On that same piece of paper, there is an excerpt from an article that says that a vampire hunter is detaining a suspect from an amusement park. Our main character and his assistant understand that the killer has definitely decided to challenge them. While touching the victim, the image of a certain white-haired man pops up in Christopher's head. His sixth sense tells him that he should definitely be somewhere nearby. Meanwhile, two young girls are sitting in a pet store and discussing the latest news they read on the internet. A tall man with ashen hair approaches them holding a small dog in his hands. The girl thanks the man for helping her pet and notes that he is incredibly handsome. Also behind the man you can see a room from which a terrible sound is coming and bats are flying everywhere. The man calms the girl down by saying that strange sounds are coming from the service room where all sorts of devices are working. A girl discusses with a man her love for animals and the fact that this pet store opened recently, after which she thanks him for his help and also asks for his phone number. The white-haired man agrees, saying that she should definitely come and visit them. Meanwhile, the police find the pale and dried corpse of another man. This man also has a bat-shaped scar on his body, and help is written on the floor in blood. The police managed to find a connection between all the dead. They were either criminals on the run who were wanted by the police, or murderers and arsonists. Our main character is informed about this all over the phone and promises to sort it all out. Standing at the window, Christopher tries to understand what the criminal wants to tell them with these signs. After some time, the hunter again tries to find the correct code to the door of his apartment. Suddenly, Jessica appears and says that he should stop breaking into someone else's apartment once again. They look at each other for a while, trying to remember that kiss at the amusement park. Christopher apologizes for his confusion and that he has once again mixed up the door to his apartment. Jessica also reports that the camera she broke has already been repaired and wants to give it away. She hands him the camera, saying that perhaps not all the files could survive. Christopher asks where her children are and why they are not home at the moment. She reports that after that incident, the kindergarten was reopened and they are now there. At this moment, Dr. Kevin calls her on the phone and informs her that he was able to find an apartment in which she can move. Jessica says she is very happy and will be able to move at the end of the week when she packs all her things. Christopher asks why she decides to move so unexpectedly and suddenly. For a second, he wonders why he cares about the move of a complete stranger. The next day, Jessica says goodbye to her colleagues, thanking them for a job well done. Behind Jessica can be seen the silhouette of the same white-haired man from the pet store. Not noticing the man behind her, she accidentally collides with his shoulder. From such a strong blow, her purse, phone, and all her personal belongings fall to the ground. The man immediately tries to apologize for what happened and tries to help our heroine pack her things. Looking into Jessica's eyes, the man tries to compliment her, saying that she is charming. In fact, he is holding a photograph of little Daisy in his hands, and the compliment is addressed specifically to her. With an evil grin on his face, he thinks to himself that she tastes very sweet. Jessica once again asks for his forgiveness, saying thank you for complimenting her daughter. The man says that it is difficult to believe that such a young woman is a mother. She begins to flirt, making excuses and saying that she looks very young. Jessica also decides to compliment the man on his height and good looks. A white-haired man reports that he recently opened a pet store with a bunch of small animals. He also hands her a business card, saying that he will promise to give her a discount if she and her daughter visit his store. Jessica accepts the invitation, thanking him for his generosity and once again apologizing to him. After Jessica turns around and leaves, the man looks after her angrily, clearly planning something sinister. After receiving compliments, Jessica rushes home to make her son and daughter happy. Along the way, remembering that she still needs to go to the store and the bank, and the trip to the pet store will have to be postponed until another day. A huge number of bats are flying in front of Christopher's apartment at this time. Opening the front door, he notices an absolute mess and things scattered on the floor. He takes out a gun, thinking that someone has broken into his apartment and is preparing an attack on him. Also on the floor of the apartment, he notices a small bat that squeaks and grins in his direction. Our hero decides to check the apartment for criminals or set traps. At the very end, he enters the bath, pulls back the curtain, and sees a white-haired man sitting with a glass of wine. It turns out to be the same white-haired man from the pet store that Jessica encountered, who offers to rub his back. Christopher looks at him and asks if he is the same maniac who managed to make so much noise lately. The stranger gets out of the bath, ironically making fun of the main character, calling him a noble vampire hunter. The hunter grabs the white-haired stranger by the neck and slams him into the wall with a strong blow. The stranger, without feeling any pain, asks why our main character is so excited. A moment later, he says that he missed his brother very much. He runs his hand over his brother's cheek, asking how he lives a normal human life as a half-vampire. The stranger holds out both hands to him with an offer to arrest him immediately. He says that there is no need to be so angry because, in any case, those people were criminals and do not deserve to live. Christopher grabs him by the neck again, and with an even more powerful blow slams him into the wall again. He tries to explain to him that their punishment should be dealt with by the court, and not by some rogue. The stranger says that everyone is minding their own business. Some kill people, and some kill vampires. He asks why you kill vampires without trial and decide who lives and who doesn't. He tells Christopher not to forget that they are of the same blood, even if only half, because the other half belongs to his human mother. After which the main character's brother forcefully squeezes his hands and removes them from his neck. He rolls up the sleeves of the main character, saying that it was because of his mother that he lost the mark of his clan. A moment later, Christopher takes on a completely different form, his eyes lighting up cool and his hair turning ashen, and he's about to punch his brother as hard as he can. At this moment, Jessica's voice is heard, who apparently entered the apartment. The white-haired man suddenly changes his face and greets his new acquaintance again, emphasizing that they just recently met. Jessica asks what happened because she heard strange sounds and banging on the wall. She also says that the shower in her apartment was broken and she wanted to ask the main character to wash at his place. Christopher understands that Jessica should not see him in this form and returns to his original form. His eyes stop glowing scarlet and his hair returns to a bright burgundy shade. Jessica manages to notice that they already met with this man today in the hospital. For a second, everyone present in the room freezes and thinks about what to do next. The brother of our main character decides to take the conversation in a different direction, trying to joke about the fact that he has fallen in love with a beautiful girl. He also puts his hand on the shoulder of our main character and says that he came to his brother from afar to visit him. He points his finger at the cracked wall, offering possible options for fixing it. Looking at this whole farce, Christopher realizes that he has almost forgotten what a master of toady and lies his brother is. Jessica says she's incredibly surprised and can't believe he has such a cute brother. Our main character understands that it is impossible to give free rein to his emotions at the moment and tries to restrain himself, while his brother continues to pretend that they are on excellent friendly terms with him. At the same moment, the patter of little feet is heard, and Daisy enters the room. Daisy runs up to her mother, grabbing her leg while holding a certain leaflet in her hand. The flyer features a small rabbit that Daisy asks her mom to buy. Jessica tries to explain to her daughter that pets require careful care and attention, and that she is too young for such responsibility. Meanwhile, the protagonist's brother says that the leaflet along with the rabbit is part of his pet store, and they can come to him at any time. Christopher understands that a cunning and insidious plan is read in his brother's gaze. He tells his brother that it is time to finish and asks the guests to leave his apartment. The main character tells Jessica that his brother needs a rest after spending time on the road. He pushes Jessica towards the exit, asking her to quickly leave for his apartment. Having thrown her out the threshold, he sharply slams the door right in her face without saying anything goodbye. He immediately decides to ask his brother about the purpose for which he went to see her at the hospital. The brother, sitting on the sofa, pretends that he does not understand what is being said and asks to bring him something to drink, after which they begin to urge his brother on, behaving like a small child who will not tell him anything. Christopher takes a bag of donated blood from the refrigerator and gives it to his brother. After taking a few sips of donor blood, he immediately begins to vomit. The brother says that he does not understand how one can drink such vile and low-grade blood. Christopher tells him that donated blood is enough to maintain life instead of killing ordinary people. The white-haired brother says that killing ordinary people shows the strength of their clan. The vampire hunter tells his brother to pack his things and get out of his apartment. The main character's brother manages to ask him about the very woman he met in the hospital and why he worries so much about her, after which he decides to once again make an ironic joke and ask what it tastes like. Christopher grabs him by the collar and tells him not to even think about approaching her, much less harming her. The brother laughs, saying that he sees in front of him a real man and not a little boy, after which, looking into his eyes, he says that he will achieve his goal by other methods. Without saying a single word, he snatches the bag of blood that he gave to his newly appeared brother. With a straight face, he points his right finger towards the exit and tells his brother to get out of here immediately. The white-haired intruder begins to act like a little child again, accusing his brother of stealing from him and now trying to push him out the door. After some time, we again find ourselves in the same pet store where the vampire hunter's brother works. Daisy and Connor are standing with their hands pressed to a display window in which sits a small white fluffy rabbit. Connor points to the rabbit's face, says that it is very round, and tries to find similarities with his sister. Daisy, in turn, also tries to joke, saying that her brother's eyes are just as black and there is not a drop of love in them. Brother and sister have been looking at different animals for quite some time and still can't decide which one to buy for their home. Meanwhile, behind them is the brother of our main character, making a strange grimace on his face and extending his hand to the small children. This picture is noticed by our main character, who at that second is standing outside the window of the pet store and sees everything that is happening from the street. The white-haired brother puts his fingers on little Daisy's hand, trying to stop her from making a hasty choice. He says that there is no need to rush. Pets also choose their owners, and you need to take a closer look at their reaction. Christopher exhales with a calm soul, realizing that his fears at the moment were in vain and nothing bad will happen. A second later, he hears a voice that tells him not to stand on the street and go inside because there is no line of people. He notices Jessica behind him, who is obviously not far from the pet store because her children should be under the supervision of their mother. He sees in front of him an unusually beautiful, young, attractive girl with long pink hair who is dressed in an elegant beige dress and holds a small yellow handbag in her hand. Seeing such a beauty, he immediately becomes embarrassed, trying to turn his face to the side and say that he was just passing by. He steps aside to let Jessica pass and open the door of the pet store where her children have been waiting for her for a long time. At the last moment, Christopher manages to grab Jessica's delicate, fragile hand with 2 fingers in the hope of saying a few words to her. She glances at him at the same moment and waits for him to say something. After a few seconds of thought, he says that she should not get close to his brother because he could pose a mortal danger to her and her children. Jessica decides to ask him again if he really says what he thinks because they are blood brothers. He is not going to directly say the reason for his fears and therefore tries to blame everything on the mental problems of his younger brother. The girl is embarrassed and thinks that Christopher is just jealous of his brother and cannot come to terms with the fact that he is better than him in everything. In parting, he tells her to listen to her words because he only wishes the best for her. Christopher turns around and waves goodbye to her, saying that he still has a lot to do and needs to go. Jessica once again tries to think about everything she heard, but she can't think of anything better than to ignore it all. In the evening of the same day, the vampire hunter will hear a strange noise and the sound of someone breaking into his apartment. Opening the front door, he sees little Connor standing in front of him with a very frightened face and asking for help. He decides to ask the little boy what he forgot here in the middle of the night. Connor replies that his mother still has not returned from work. He suspects that something happened to her because he cannot reach her on the phone. Looking at his phone, Christopher notices a message saying that his fish was caught on someone else's hook, and he needs to hurry if he wants to save it. When our main character sees the message, he falls into a stupor, but understands that he needs to act quickly and decisively. While nothing has happened yet. Meanwhile, Jessica finds herself completely tied up, her arms and legs taped, and a black blindfold hanging over her eyes. Meanwhile, our main character's brother is nearby, holding scissors in his hands and listening to the cries of a poor defenseless woman for help. He brings the scissors to the rope on which the poor girl is hanging, saying that this beautiful view is clearly lacking in tones, and he wants to add a little red tint to this performance. Having seated Connor on the sofa, Christopher once again tries to call Jessica, continuing to hear beeps coming from the phone. For the umpteenth time he hears the message, "Sorry, the subscriber is unavailable," or is out of the network coverage area, which makes the fear even greater. The worried boy still can't calm down, trying once again to find solace in Christopher's words. Despite the anxiety tormenting him, the vampire hunter tries to maintain composure and decides to check with the boy where his sister is now. Connor, sitting on the sofa with tear-stained eyes, tries to explain through his tears that Daisy is sleeping now and he didn't want to wake her. In such a stressful situation, a little boy needs support like nothing else. They put a hand on his head and tell him to take care of his sister without leaving home. The thoughts that something bad could happen to his mother still cannot leave his worried mind. Christopher, looking into the eyes of this small defenseless creature, promises that everything will be fine with his mother and he will definitely help her out. Having gone on a search, the first thought that comes to our main character is the involvement of his white-haired brother in this whole situation. Having reached his brother and asking first where Jessica is, he only receives a mocking answer regarding the skills of our protagonist's search dog. A moment later, Christopher takes on his vampire form and tells his brother that if even one hair falls from the girl's head, his days will be numbered. Through his brother's voice, our main character hears Jessica's screams, judging by which she does not understand where and in what place she is. At this moment, our heroine, blindfolded, in absolute shock, and apparently only recently coming to her senses, is trying to understand what happened to her. Having time to at least collect her thoughts a little, she understands that the situation is stalemate, and any help, even the most insignificant, will not hurt her now. Hearing the scream of a defenseless girl, our main character falls into a fit of mild rage, trying to find out what his brother did to her, loudly shouting his name Jacob. Feigning complete indifference to this situation, he says that he does not understand why his brother is so alarmed, and in his opinion, she is completely fine. Clearly planning some evil plan, Jacob sets a timer on his phone for exactly 5 minutes. I have time to tell my brother that she is completely fine for now and he should hurry up. In his head, the insidious kidnapper manages to think that Jessica should not worry about her freedom, and in 5 minutes he will let her go, although he is not sure whether she will like such freedom. After his brother hangs up, Christopher is left standing all alone, trying to understand. What should he do next? After those same 5 minutes, Jacob becomes bored and tries to understand why his brother still didn't come. Looking at the slowly expiring numbers of the timer, he says that the last thing he likes in this life is waiting for something. He picks up those very sharp scissors and tells the suspended girl that her time is up. Without any doubt, with complete composure and confidence, he cuts the rope on which Jessica is suspended. At that very second, the girl does not understand what is happening and begins to rapidly fall down, frantically screaming for help. Our main character immediately appears, who was clearly waiting for the moment, observing everything that was happening from a secluded place. Being in the guise of a vampire, he quickly grabs the falling Jessica, saving her from certain death. A frightened and understanding girl is trying to find out who managed to come to her rescue. Being nearby, and not understanding who her savior is, she is surprised that his smell seems so familiar to her. Looking at all this, Jacob wonders why an ordinary mortal woman is so important to his brother. After landing, Christopher sits the frightened and shocked girl on a bench. Literally for a moment he falls into a stupor as he realizes that she shouldn't see him in this form. Our protagonist remembers that all this time the girl cannot move, and we need to help her remove the shackles from her arms and legs. Frightened, Jessica tries to remove the evil eye bandage in order to find out the name and appearance of her savior. Christopher stops Jessica, preventing her from removing the blindfold and telling her that his appearance must remain a secret to her. The girl decides to guess the reason, saying that her savior is a little scary, putting our main character in a stupor. Before she can recover from the shock and trying to thank her savior, Jessica begins to lose consciousness. "I'm trying to save the injured girl from being hit." He grabs her and accidentally removes the mask from her face. Looking at her condition, he realizes that she needs medical attention immediately. After some time, Jessica, lying on the bed, begins to slowly come to her senses. Trying to gather all the little strength she has left, she tries to open her eyes, seeing in front of her the indistinct silhouette of a man in a robe. Open her eyes. She realizes that the man standing right in front of him turns out to be Dr. Kevin, who immediately begins to take an interest in her well-being. Jessica tries to slowly get out of bed, realizing that she has not yet fully recovered from the shock and tragedy that she had to endure. Kevin reports that she was found unconscious and passed out for more than 12 hours. Still reeling from shock, Jessica tries to gather the remnants of her memories in her head and understand what happened to her. In her head, she sees blurry silhouettes and fragments of the situation in which she had to find herself. She remembers that a certain man saved her and decides to ask Dr. Kevin where he is. The doctor does not understand what the victim is talking about and what kind of man she is talking about. Jessica decides to find out how she ended up in the hospital, receiving a reply that she was found near the front door. At the same second, the door of the chamber opens, and Christopher's silhouette is visible in the doorway. Our heroine tries to demonstrate the deduction of Sherlock Holmes, arguing that the person who saved her immediately left, as well as how he ended up there and why he saved her. Dr. Kevin decides to clarify whether our patient hit her head, because judging by the test results, she had a concussion. The doctor realizes that the girl is so immersed in her thoughts that she doesn't even hear his question, and he tries to attract attention by waving his hand in front of her face. Kevin tries to shout to Jessica in a more rude manner, trying with all his might to make his presence known. Even after this failure, he realizes that trying to reach her is useless because there is zero emotion on her face. He puts her hand on her head with the last of his strength, praying that she remember what happened to her. At this moment, a nurse enters the room, simultaneously touching Christopher, who is standing in the doorway. The doctor and Jessica realize that they are not alone and immediately turn their attention to them. Our heroine wonders why the policeman and neighbor are barely familiar to her and end up in her room. Kevin, seeing the vampire hunter for the first time, tries to understand what kind of strange man was here. Feeling some kind of danger, he immediately decides to check with Jessica if they know this strange man. The nurse entering the room informs that the doctor should go to the operating room where they are waiting for him. Kevin says that he needs to go and he will definitely visit her after the operation, but for now she needs rest. The main character reassures the doctor and says that there is no need to worry because the operation is much more important than her. Almost at the very exit from the ward, as Christopher passes by, a slight tension hangs between them. Jessica picks up the phone and sees 17 missed calls from our main character. She immediately decides to find out why Christopher tried so hard to call her last night. He replies that he couldn't sleep because her children were making too much noise and he needed to take care of them. For a moment, Jessica thought that it was Christopher who saved her that night, but when she heard that he had been with her children all this time, she threw that thought aside. She also decided to clarify for what purpose the unknown man decided to visit her in the hospital. He tries at all costs not to show that he knows how this situation developed and says that he came to see a friend. Jessica immediately puts him up to date, telling him that she was kidnapped last night. Christopher continues to play his role with all his appearance, trying to feign surprise and not give away his lie. Jessica decides to once again replay in her memory all the events and those fragments of memories that she was able to come to, simultaneously telling this to our main character. She recalls that there were no signs of trouble. She once again returned home late from work. Suddenly, out of nowhere, she felt a special sweet aroma captivating her mind, after which her head began to feel very dizzy, and at that very moment she began to lose consciousness. The last thing she remembers is lying on the ground, unable to move a single part of her body. Jessica begins to assume that at the moment when she began to lose consciousness, she hit her head, which gave her a concussion. After she woke up, she was already tied up and hanging from a rope from nowhere. After all the thinking, she decides to assume that the kidnapper is a vampire. Christopher is very surprised by the girl's words, and he decides to ask again if she is sure of this. Jessica emphatically replies that she is confident in her words and begins to list some facts. She says that before passing out, she vaguely saw a shadow on the ground, and this silhouette could not belong to a person. At the last moment, she sees in front of her the silhouette of a man in a suit, whose face in her condition was impossible to see. Secondly, she claims that when she was falling, another mysterious person appeared who managed to save her. Continuing to play the role of a person who does not understand anything, the vampire hunter decides to clarify what exactly this person was. She replies that she doesn't remember his face at all, but if it weren't for him, she would have already met her ancestors in the next world. Jessica claims that an ordinary person is not capable of such a thing, and unfortunately, she did not have time to thank him. Memories of the very moment when the stranger managed to save her from imminent death once again flash through her head. Our heroine says that at that very moment she felt a seductive and sweet aroma, somewhat similar to blood, and he claims that the man who kidnapped her and the man who saved her are both vampires. At this moment, Christopher began to panic a little, and a fleeting excitement flashed across his face. He assumed that she could guess about everything. Jessica continues to build theories and guess why the vampire decided to kidnap her. She is worried about why, instead of drinking her blood, he decided to throw her from a great height. At the same second, the scream of a man is heard, bringing a huge bouquet of flowers into the room. This man turns out to be the brother of our main character, Jacob, holding a bouquet of huge light yellow lilies in his hands. The blonde brother starts shouting that I have been finding a place for myself ever since I found out that she was hospitalized. Christopher is trying his best to restrain the rage seething within him and the desire to deal with his brother right here and now. Jacob runs up to Jessica, giving her the bouquet and starting to wonder what state she is in right now. A trembling silence hangs between him and his brother in the room, and they stare at each other. The vampire hunter immediately grabs his brother, telling him to get out of here immediately. Jacob grins and says that it is not up to him whether he leaves or stays here. Christopher is unable to understand his brother's intentions and asks what he is really after. The white-haired sly man begins to pretend to be a little boy and say that he just came to visit his sister, pointing out that Jessica does not belong only to the vampire hunter. Having jumped out of bed, the girl begins to defend Jacob, saying that he is always belittled and insulted. Christopher understands that he is not in the best situation and tries to somehow justify his actions. Jessica asks why he is always against his brother, because he just came to visit her, and there are no bad intentions in his actions. Jacob tries to put on a funny grimace, saying with all his appearance that it was he who won this duel. Our main character has no choice but to grit his teeth to accept reality and end this conversation. Jessica tries to take matters into her own hands, trying to reconcile two warring brothers. Suddenly she grabs their hands, puts them together, and says that this is exactly what people who love each other should do. This act on the part of our heroine clearly does not please either one or the other. Christopher notices that, having taken his hand, Jessica's temperature has risen sharply and her skin has turned red. A slight degree of embarrassment appears on the girl's face, which forces her to justify herself in the current situation. Trying to change the topic of conversation, she once again insists that Jacob and Christopher must get along. After the words have been spoken, she throws the two brothers out the door, saying that she needs rest and they can see each other later. Left alone, the vampire hunter's brother says that this girl is very funny, and it seems that he has begun to understand why his brother is pining for her. Jacob begins to envy his older brother, trying to turn the current situation into his favor. At this moment, inner rage begins to boil in Christopher's eyes again, and his eyes begin to glow red. At the same moment, he delicately and imperceptibly takes out a dagger hidden inside from the sleeve of his suit. The desire to take revenge on his brother for the inconvenience caused begins to overflow. The vampire hunter makes a lightning-fast swing with the desire to pierce his brother with that same dagger. Thanks to his vampire strength, Jacob manages to react to his older brother's attack. Using his supernatural abilities, he manages to dodge and move aside. Looking into his brother's eyes, he was amused and so easily pissed him off and provoked him to emotions. He warns and tells his brother to keep his eyes on her, otherwise he could steal her again at any moment. After which our main character's brother hurries to leave the hospital as soon as possible. At this moment, Christopher receives a call from the police station, saying that an incident has occurred on the outskirts of the city, and he should immediately arrive at the scene. Not having time to move away from his brother's prank, he realizes that work is much more important for him, immediately moving to the crime scene. Meanwhile, standing behind the closed door, Jessica cannot calm down, feeling her heart pounding. She once again remembers how she touched Christopher's hand and begins to replay snippets of memories in her head. She compares his hands to the very touches when she was saved from falling from the roof. She also remembers the warmth of her palms that she felt on that very day a long time ago. A fleeting hope flashes through her eyes that all this may not just be a coincidence. Jessica is not entirely sure whether Christopher is an ordinary person and whether vampires can protect innocent citizens. After which Jessica catches herself wondering why she suddenly begins to compare all these people in her head. Her thoughts are immediately interrupted by a young intern in a pink robe who enters the ward. The nurse reports that the new head of the hospital has arrived and they are holding a meeting, which it is best for Jessica to attend if her health has already improved. Our victim puts on her work coat and realizes that she needs to get all these thoughts out of her head, and now work awaits her. Meanwhile, somewhere on the outskirts of the city, the same police operation is taking place. The police department where our protagonist works is clearing out another group of vampires. Christopher, having caught another bloodsucker, holds him at gunpoint, preventing him from moving. The vampire claims that his death will not change the course of things because this is a much more serious chess game. The vampire pawn claims that the pathetic humans will not be able to resist them and their time will soon come. The vampire hunter begins to blackmail the bloodsucker, saying that if he does not lay everything out here and now, he may not count on an easy death. Christopher is called out by his assistant, saying that they found something and it needs to be examined immediately. The vampire, without thinking twice, decides to take advantage of the current situation and frees himself from his shackles. He makes a sharp dash towards the hunter, hoping to finish him off with one blow as quickly as possible. Christopher's assistant manages to react to the vampire's attack and warn his boss about the threat. Our main character manages to grab the bloodsucker's neck, not giving him the opportunity to sink his fangs and drink his blood. In a matter of seconds, a shot is fired that hits the attacker straight in the head. Christopher's partner still manages to react, taking a pistol out of his holster and firing a shot, after which he immediately tries to apologize for distracting Christopher and exposing him to attack. The vampire hunter says that it will no longer be possible to extract at least some information from this pawn. They need to examine the evidence found. They move on and come across a strange room filled with many clues that interest them. Our hero sees in front of him a huge number of different scientific records and test tubes with reagents. Together with an assistant, they try to begin to analyze and structure what they see before their eyes. The main character's partner notes that for the first time in his life, he sees a real vampire laboratory. Christopher says that all the contents of this laboratory must be seized and thoroughly examined. At this moment, he receives a message from Jessica on his phone asking him to spend the evening with her children. He is slightly surprised by such a request, but still decides to devote some of his free time to the kids. He decides to call little Daisy and ask if everything is okay with her brother, because he will be a little late at work. Through the speaker of the phone, he hears the cry of a little girl and decides to find out if everything is okay with her and where exactly she is. Little Daisy reports that they are in the pet store of our main character's older brother. At this time, Jacob notices this picture and grins, talking about his hope that his brother will have time to come to the party. Meanwhile, the new head of the hospital is broadcasting a very ardent and fiery speech from the stage to his subordinates. A tall, dark-haired and very attractive man with a monocle over one eye stands on stage, trying to encourage his colleagues. The entire staff, including Jessica, is delighted to have a new, so handsome head of their medical institution. After the meeting ends, Jessica and a group of nurses discuss the appearance and age of the new leader. One of the nurses begins to build theories regarding whether he has a girlfriend or wife. The other one is trying to draw attention to the fact that even though he looks good, they should think about his character. Jessica interrupts and says that these two loving girls should keep working and not think about such things. The girls' conversation is interrupted by the head of the hospital, who calls out to Jessica and asks for some time. She turns around and on her face you can see slight embarrassment, which is immediately replaced by a smile in complete agreement. At the same time, she thinks that he heard their entire conversation with the nurses. Moving towards the head, her friends who remain in the background encourage her and wish her luck. The new head of the clinic, whose name is Thomas, is a highly sought-after specialist and scientist in the field of genetic engineering. He asks Jessica about her recent injury and how she shouldn't have come to the meeting in that condition. She thanks him for his concern and tries to reassure him that everything is fine. Thomas insists on saying that Jessica should go home and he will take care of the rest. A smile appears on our heroine's face. She is sure that the head is a very kind and sincere person. For a second, she wonders how he knows her name, but then she remembers that all the information is written on her badge. After which she goes home with the thought that she will return home early, and her son and daughter will be very happy about this. Looking at her phone, she notices that her children are at the pet store and decides to pick them up from there. At that very moment in the pet store, little Daisy hands the wounded puppy into Jacob's hands. She asks him if he will be okay, calling the little puppy her brother. Jacob reassures the little girl by saying that everything will be fine with him, and also asks if she is hungry, after which he gently and carefully places the little puppy in an enclosure where he will obviously be comfortable and safe. Our main character's brother picks up a little girl and invites her to go get a little snack, something he naturally agrees to. At the same second, the door of the pet store swings open, and on the threshold we see Christopher, who loudly pronounces his brother's name. He turns around ironically and decides to make fun of the fact that he arrived faster than expected. Christopher, full of rage, tries to get closer to him as quickly as possible, extending his hand in his direction. Coming close, he snatches from his hands a little girl who does not have time to understand anything. Then, clenching his right hand into a fist, he hits Jacob in the face with all his might. Without having time to react to such a lightning-fast attack, his brother somehow, miraculously, continues to stand on his feet, after which he decides to check with little Daisy to see if everything is okay with her, if she is injured and where her brother is now. Daisy tries to explain that she is fine and that her brother was bleeding heavily, but she doesn't have time to finish her sentence. At this moment, Jessica appears at the door of the store and falls to her knees upon hearing that her son has started bleeding, which her daughter had just mentioned. Slightly dumbfounded by the current situation, Christopher looks in surprise at his mother, the little girl he is holding in his arms, and asks what she is doing here. Jessica grabs his shirt and starts trying very loudly to find out what happened to her son and why he is bleeding. Christopher himself, not fully understanding what is happening now, stands in a daze, not knowing how to answer this question. Unexpectedly for everyone, Connor comes out of the closet with a bandage on his right knee covering a small wound. A frightened mother immediately runs up to him, saying that she almost fainted from what she heard. Connor doesn't have time to say a word in his defense before he immediately drowns in the arms of his mother. Not fully understanding what is happening, he tries to calm Jessica down and asks her to stop crying. Daisy, sitting in Christopher's arms, talks about how he beat his little brother, and then his mother burst into tears. After hearing the words, little Connor immediately decides to defend his mother and, waving his fists, challenges the offender to a duel. Gritting his teeth, our main character thinks to himself that this child doesn't even understand what danger he is in now. Jessica, continuing to worry about her son, is trying to find out how he was injured. He explains that he simply decided to help a little puppy who fell from a slope, but ended up getting into trouble himself. Connor also says that Jacob saved him and then helped him bandage his wound. Our protagonist's younger brother, who has recovered from the blow, instructs the little boy to be more careful in the future. Having finally figured it all out, Jessica thanks him for saving and helping her son. Jacob says that this is nothing for him, and he is always happy to help a small child in need. He thinks that his older brother is incredibly good and quickly like the wind, after which he grabs little Connor standing nearby. Daisy, sitting in Christopher's arms, is very surprised and asks if her brother knows Kung Fu. He replies that to tell the truth he has superpowers, and if suddenly the kids are in danger, he becomes a superhero. Dissatisfaction clearly appears on Christopher's face, and the little girl tries to get down and says that she wants to see his younger brother. Running up to Jacob, little Daisy smiles, and he declares that he has prepared a little snack and wants everyone present to appreciate his cooking skills. Our main character's head is filled with thoughts that his brother is an excellent actor, and he will never just help a person without a reason. Jessica interrupts his thoughts and says that he needs to stop being so serious, and it would be best to have a little snack. He decides to disagree with the girl's statement and says that it would be better for her and her children to go home now. She grabs his hand and tells him that he needs to stop being stubborn and be a little more serious. Jessica drags our protagonist by the hand, saying that she couldn't even imagine how arrogant he was and that the whole situation was just a misunderstanding. A slight pinkness and embarrassment appear on the face of our main character, and his attempts to convey that the current situation is extremely dangerous do not stop. Jessica thanks our protagonist for the zeal and care with which he worried about her daughter. A beautiful smile appears on her face, and in the evening she promises to cook him a sumptuous dinner and asks him not to be upset. The vampire hunter turns out to be not so invincible after all, and decides to agree with Jessica. He decides to cast aside his doubts, thinking that while he is here, his brother is unlikely to dare to do anything weird. Meanwhile, Jacob, standing nearby, thinks that the situation is becoming much more fun than he expected. But an ominous grin appears on his face, and his thoughts are occupied only with whether luck will continue to accompany his brother. After which he decides to change the bandage for little Connor, who reassured him that the wound would heal soon. Connor thanks the brother of our main character and tells him not to worry because his mother is a nurse and will always be able to provide him with first aid. Having completed their business, everyone present, including Christopher, decides to leave the pet store and say goodbye to its owner one last time. Jessica says it's getting late in the evening and they need to get home as soon as possible. In parting, Jacob asks them to stop by his establishment as soon as they have free time. Christopher at this moment does not take his eyes off him and promises to follow him, and a colossal degree of dissatisfaction is visible on his face. Jacob also shouts after the departing heroes to stop by more often, and he will also visit them with the kids. Jessica thanks him for his friendliness, and his older brother is in some shock because he doesn't understand how he could so quickly forget what happened just an hour ago. Returning home, Christopher explains to our heroine what he would prefer for dinner. At the same moment, a mysterious man in a hood and a black mask covering him passes by them. Christopher suddenly stops, where Jessica decides to concentrate his attention because all his eyes were focused on this man. He decides to push aside the disturbing thoughts, trying to get the mysterious stranger out of his head. At this moment, the brother of our main character is holding a bloody bandage in his hands. Jacob sniffs the blood from the bandage, saying that there is something indescribably attractive about this child, and his stupid brother could not even notice it. Immediately behind him is the same mysterious man in a hood and mask who had just passed by our main characters. The man takes off his mask, revealing the new head of the hospital, Thomas, and judging by his bright red eyes and fangs protruding from his mouth, he is most likely also a vampire. He falls to his knee in front of Jacob, saying that he had just taken up his position at the hospital and could not immediately leave to report to the young master. A slight rage appears on the face of the main character's brother. He clarifies whether his assistant really did not have time or whether he is looking down on him. Continuing to kneel, Thomas tries to justify himself that he really did not have time, and he would never in his life dare to look down on the gentleman. Jacob pats him on the shoulder, saying that he is just joking, and at this moment in time, he does not need his report at all. He orders him to get up from his knees and not be so submissive because the city is under his jurisdiction. He also gives instructions to pretend that they have not seen each other, and for now he can go about his business. Thomas agrees, saying that he is ready to do anything in the name of the young master, as well as carry out any of his orders. In parting, he says that our Jessica works at Thomas's hospital and that he should not dare touch her or her children or try to cause them any harm. Thomas, having experienced incredible fear, exhales and agrees with every word he hears. He looks after the departing master and promises to always be faithful and remain on his side. In his thoughts, he is very sad that Jessica was his master's target, while at the same time feeling relieved that he promised not to interfere in local affairs. Meanwhile, little Connor ruffles Christopher's hair and says that his brother is better than him. Little Daisy in turn makes fun of the fact that he has another rival. Apparently, the children sitting on our protagonist's shoulders are clearly trying to piss him off. Jessica asks if our main character is jealous of her brother because it looks very childish. The embarrassment that appears on his face clearly betrays him, but still he says that this is pure stupidity. Meanwhile, the children sitting on Christopher's shoulders realize that both he and their mother are acting like little ones. With all this, Jessica manages to notice the embarrassment that appeared on the vampire hunter's face. Looking down, he tries to come up with an excuse and says that he just had a fever. There were no signs of trouble when suddenly a huge and powerful explosion was heard behind them. They immediately turn around, trying to understand what happened and assess the damage. Christopher tells Jessica to take the children and get as far away from here as possible, and he will stay and help the wounded. She tries to stop him by saying that she works as a nurse and is quite capable of providing first aid to someone. For a second, thoughts appear in her head because she can't just take her children with her, who might get hurt. Out of nowhere, a woman appears with a small child who is apparently the mother of a friend of her children, and they go to the same kindergarten. She says that the explosion most likely occurred due to a vampire attack. Many people were injured, and they need to leave as soon as possible. She asks a woman who just appeared out of nowhere to look after Connor and Daisy for a while she goes to check what happened. She pats her son and daughter on the head and asks them to forgive them for their selfish behavior. Jessica tries to explain that her job as a nurse and her duty compel her to help the victims. Connor assures his mother not to worry because he and his sister can take care of themselves. Finally, very worried, Daisy warns her mother to be extremely careful and not get into bad situations. Little Connor decides to cheer up his sister by saying that the evil guy also went there and he can protect his mother. The same woman whom Jessica trusted her children asks them to leave the scene as soon as possible. Suddenly, at that very second, Dr. Thomas appears behind them, who says that he will help them. Making her way through the rubble, ruins, and fire, Jessica sees almost nothing, trying to cover her mouth with her hand in order to reduce the amount of carbon monoxide she inhales. All her thoughts at this moment are occupied only with whether everything will be okay with Christopher, because there was a rather serious explosion. Looking around, she notices a wounded victim near her. This victim turns out to be not a person, but a vampire lying in a pile of rubble and bleeding. This picture clearly puts Jessica in shock, and panic and primitive horror appear on her face. From the shock she experienced, she immediately falls to the ground, saying that the vampire's corpse scared her to death and Christopher must be somewhere nearby. She also manages to notice a piece of someone's hair in the hands of a vampire lying on the ground. At this moment, unsuspecting Jessica, another bloodsucker sneaks up from behind. She hears someone scream coming from the depths of the ruins and manages to react and turn around. The vampires manage to make a sweeping blow, but fortunately, Jessica manages to dodge thanks to a scream she hears. A moment later, our main character appears in the guise of a vampire and manages to grab the attacker. After which, with a powerful blow to the ground, he sends the bloodsucker into the world of dreams. Because of the smoke, Jessica does not have time to see or understand anything, realizing only that it was Christopher's voice. Without thinking twice, our protagonist understands that he should not be caught in this form and takes on his original form. Having risen to her feet, Jessica notices the same man whom she is accustomed to seeing. Christopher immediately begins to scold her, saying that she never listens to him, and he told her to leave here with the children. After which he presses her to himself with his hand and tries to find out if she is injured and everything is fine. Slightly shocked, Jessica tries to calm down and explain that she is fine. For a second, she wonders whether her own eyes are deceiving her and whether what she saw is really true. Immediately, she remembers for what purpose she went after the main character and decides to check with him whether there are any wounded or injured among the rubble. He replies that all the vampires have been neutralized and the civilians are hiding in the supermarket across the street and medical help will arrive soon. After it's all over, he sends Jessica home and he stays behind, saying that he needs to check something else. In turn, she manages to grab the main character's hand, causing embarrassment to appear on his face again. She begins to be mischievous, saying that the main character cannot leave because he is also wounded and needs medical attention. She drags him by the hand, saying that she cannot let him go and he will go with her because his first aid skills to himself leave much to be desired. With all this, Christopher tries to resist and convince her that he will under no circumstances go to the hospital because he still has a lot to do. Jessica's face clearly shows confidence and intensity, and the fact that she is under no circumstances going to let him go. Having reached the store, the first thing she does is begin to help the victims, one of whom turns out to be a grey-haired grandfather. She explains to him that he has no serious injuries. She provided him with first aid, but it would be better to go to the hospital for a professional examination. Grandfather smiles and thanks our heroine for the help provided to him, because if it weren't for her, everything could have ended much worse. Finally, he says that thanks to her and her boyfriend, they were all saved, after which Jessica, a little shocked, begins to become very embarrassed and blush. And at that very second, he tries to justify that he and Christopher are not a couple, but grandfather continues to insist on his own. In order to change the topic of conversation, Jessica remembers that we need to provide first aid to our main character because he was also injured. Christopher once again tries to say that everything is fine with him and he doesn't need help. The girl begins to get angry and pull at his shirt, trying to find out why he is so stubborn and distrustful. Looking at everything that is happening, grandfather smiles and is even more convinced of his thoughts that they are a couple. Taking off his shirt, she sees 3 long, sharp claw cuts on his body, clearly left by some kind of vampire. Jessica begins to panic, talking about how he can think he's fine with such a serious injury. Christopher exhales, explaining that he knew how Jessica would react to all this and did not want to admit the truth. At this time, tears begin to fill the face of Jessica, who is standing near the first aid kit, and her smile gives way to sadness and despair. Christopher notices all this, realizing that she is too worried and is about to cry, and immediately tries to calm her down. Turning to him, she sharply and confidently asks him to raise his hands so that she can treat the wound. Looking at her, Christopher promises to be extremely careful next time in order to reduce the degree of her excitement. Looking at him with a very menacing look, she explains that next time if he is early, he should not try to hide her and ask for help. Then, without a moment's hesitation, she begins to treat his wound and apply a bandage. At the same second, she receives a call on her phone from her son and her daughter, whom she left with that same woman. On the phone, little Daisy reports that something strange is happening to their friend's mother. She feels very bad, and they don't know what to do. After hanging up, she reports that the woman with whom she left her children suddenly became ill, and she needs to check it out. Without the slightest hesitation, she immediately goes in search of her children, and Christopher says that he will go with her. Slightly miscalculating his strength, he forgets about the injury he received and, gritting his teeth, grabs his shoulder with his hand. Frightened that he has become even worse, Jessica shudders for a second, trying to find out if everything is okay with him. She explains that he doesn't need to hold back, and if he can't go, he should stay and rest, and at the same time an ambulance appears in the background. The doctor, Kevin, comes out of the car, notices our heroes, and begins to ask Jessica what happened here and where the victims are. Our heroine is very happy to see her good friend and colleague, which causes a fleeting smile to appear on her face. She immediately brings him up to date by saying that there is another patient nearby whom she was going to examine. Jessica also asks to look after Christopher, saying that he was seriously injured and he also needs help. Then she turns around and says that she is leaving because her children need help and they could be in serious danger. Christopher again declares that he will go with her because he cannot let her go alone and she will probably need someone's help. Fury immediately flares up inside Jessica, causing her to start screaming at our main character, saying that she has already repeated more than once that he needs treatment. The frightened vampire hunter remains next to Dr. Kevin, watching the departing girl. A slight smile appears on Kevin's face, and he says that this is the first time he has seen his subordinate in such a state, after which he begins to laugh and marvel at how brave she is, because he himself became a little scared. Christopher tries to put on a serious face, justifying himself by saying that he just gave her the opportunity to be a little proud of himself. The doctor puts his hand on his shoulder, trying to console him and suggesting that he go to the hospital for a routine examination. Speaking of which, if he is really injured, he needs to quickly get a transfusion of a special red medicine. To which our protagonist agrees and tells Kevin to stop interfering in other people's affairs. Meanwhile, Jessica is on a quest, following the only shortest path to the house where the woman with whom she left her children lives. Suddenly, Jessica's search is interrupted by an unexpected voice calling her mother. From around the corner, the silhouette of Connor is visible, waving his hand at her and saying that he and his sister are here. Jessica runs up, sees a frightened trio of children next to the lying body of a woman, and hears that she fainted. First of all, she decides to examine her, check her pulse and breathing in order to make sure whether she is alive or not. Having completed the initial examination, she decides to clarify with Connor in more detail what really happened. Connor explains that he himself did not fully understand what happened. A man approached their friend's mother and asked several questions, after which the frightened Connor explains that their friend's mother suddenly became ill and fell to the ground. Having heard all of the above, Jessica understands that most likely it was after contact with this man that the woman lost consciousness. Meanwhile, her frightened little boy asks if his mother will be okay. Our heroine decides to pat the child on the head, trying to calm him down and saying that she will definitely help his mother. After some time, the injured girl is taken to the hospital, where Jessica and Thomas try to find out what happened. The head of the hospital concludes that there are no traumatic injuries, and the vital signs are very stable. Based on Jessica's words that there was a vampire attack nearby, he decides to diagnose that the loss of consciousness was caused by shock and sudden fear. Jessica turns out to be very happy with this conclusion, saying that the children saw a certain man who, in Jessica's opinion, could harm this woman. Also at home, she notes that just in case, it would be better to take a blood test from the woman. The patient lying on the bed at this time begins to fidget and make strange sounds. She opens her eyes, which inexplicably glow bright red. The nurse in the doctor's room, conducting a conversation, does not see how the woman, who is clearly not herself, gets out of bed. By chance, Jessica decides to turn around and see an incomprehensibly emerging situation in front of her. In an instant, the distraught patient grabs our main character by the neck and presses her to herself. The head of the hospital, clearly not expecting the situation to turn out this way, stands in shock, not knowing what exactly he needs to do now. The distraught woman, holding Jessica with one hand, grabs the stand with the IV with the other. At this moment, Thomas continues to stand in a stupor, not understanding how to resolve this situation. The only thought that comes to him in such a stressful situation is to try to calm the patient down with words and ask her to let the nurse go. The doctor's attempts to calm the patient clearly fail, since the victim herself clearly does not understand what is happening to her now and also cannot control herself. Jessica tries to calm the attacker down, explaining to her that she has lost consciousness and is most likely experiencing shock at the moment. The distraught woman clearly does not hear a single word that our heroine is trying to convey to her and strangles her with all her might with her right hand. You are in such a stressful situation. Jessica tries to analyze what is happening and comes to the conclusion that the woman is not crazy, but looks like a vampire. She remembers that she saw similar behavior of bloodsuckers and also notices her pupils glowing brightly red. The injured patient raises the stand she is holding with her left hand, clearly intending to throw it. A moment later, the thrown stand hits the doctor, Thomas, who clearly did not expect this. At this moment, the distraught woman begins to move slowly towards the window, still holding Jessica next to her. In pain from the blow, the head of the hospital does not find anything better in this situation than to shout Jessica's name. A second later, the woman holding our heroine with her falls through the window and begins to fall down. At the very last moment, Dr. Thomas manages to grab the frightened Jessica. Being in a stressful situation, the adrenaline in his blood allows him to hold it with one hand and prevent it from falling down. Jessica doesn't understand what happened literally in a matter of seconds, trying to figure out how to climb up. Being in such a difficult situation, they are both trying to figure out how to help each other. At this moment, the distraught woman manages to land on the roof of a nearby building, when suddenly, with an unexpected left hook, she is knocked out by the appearing vampire hunter, who clearly still has not had time to recover. Having clearly witnessed what is happening, he looks at the body of the woman lying in front of him and tries to understand how this could happen. By the smell, Christopher understands that the woman is not a vampire and tries to figure out how an ordinary person could jump out of the task and remain unharmed. I'm trying to inspect the building from which the woman jumped. He comes across the same window in which he notices a doctor and a nurse. He sees Jessica and Dr. Thomas, who was still able to get her out of such a difficult situation and put her on her feet. Assessing the appearance of the head of the hospital and not knowing him, he tries to understand what kind of person is standing next to Jessica. Meanwhile, the doctor and our heroine, not knowing what happened outside, say that it is necessary to check the condition of the patient after falling from the window. Jessica grabs her left shoulder, which is clearly damaged after such an unexpected fall from the window. Thomas stops her, saying that after her injury, it is better for her to stay here, and he will call other personnel. At the same second, a concerned Christopher bursts into the room, observing the entire situation. Thomas Jessica notices the main character suddenly bursting into the room, which makes both of them feel slightly frightened. The only thing that catches Christopher's gaze at this moment is the doctor's hand lying on Jessica's shoulder, which clearly causes him to have an attack of jealousy. Thomas explains that there is no point in delaying the injury, and that a bandage should be applied immediately, and he should leave. After which I try to leave the room, he meets the gaze of the vampire hunters, and a slight tension hangs between them. With a slight grin on his face, Thomas, feigning complete friendliness, asks to let him in because he needs to help patients. Without saying a word, Christopher takes a step to the side, allowing the doctor to pass forward, while simultaneously analyzing the fact that he is an ordinary person and cannot be a vampire. His thoughts are interrupted by a gentle female voice, asking him why he is here in this form. Jessica, frightened by the situation and concerned, runs up to him and asks if he had time to treat the wound he received. As if not noticing our heroine's words, Christopher is interested in who this strange man is, and also points out that she should stay away from him. In response to his question, he only hears an explanation that this man is their new dean, as well as the head of the hospital. Jessica also emphasizes that Christopher forbids her to communicate with any man who appears in her life, including his brother and Dr. Thomas. Concerned, Christopher immediately grabs Jessica by the shoulder, trying to find out if she was hurt and what happened. With a slight grin on her face, pretending that nothing happened, she explains that she fell out of the window, and the dean helped pull her out, causing her shoulder to be slightly dislocated. Having heard this, our main character falls into slight bewilderment, trying to understand how she could fall out of the window. After which he immediately grabs Jessica in his arms, which makes our heroine begin to get very worried and embarrassed. Christopher explains that he cannot allow her to move in this condition and will carry her to the doctor in his arms. Walking down the corridor with a girl in her arms who is covering her face and experiencing incredible embarrassment, they attract the attention of the entire hospital staff. Jessica tries to explain that it is not necessary to carry her in her arms and that she only injured her shoulder and can move around on her own. He takes her to Dr. Kevin's office, who tells her that she's fine and not to worry. Jessica is told that she just has a minor sprain and it will not cause any major problems or complications. Concerned Christopher is clearly in a state of shock and worries about Jessica's health more than she does. Stephen points out that instead of getting too excited, they should be more careful and asks them to wait a little, after which he leaves them alone for a while, leaving the office and saying that he will bring medicine for the girl and the hunter. At this time, Jessica decides to check the work chat on her phone, in which the entire staff is discussing the situation in which she was carried in their arms throughout the hospital. Dissatisfaction clearly appears on her face, as she believes that such behavior by Christopher will cause a large number of rumors among the entire staff. Not wanting to fully admit his guilt, our main character tries to pretend that he is sincerely guilty and asks for forgiveness. Jessica smiles, realizing that she is in vain blaming our protagonist for everything, and she herself begins to ask him for forgiveness. The vampire hunter looks into the eyes of the still slightly frightened girl and speaks of his regret that he was not there when she was in danger. After these words, they both begin to behave like little children, embarrassed in front of each other and trying to make excuses. Subsequently, silence hangs in the room for some time, and they both do not know what to say to their interlocutor. At this time, Dr. Kevin is near the refrigerator with donor blood trying to select a suitable sample. He finds a package that is about to expire and will be destroyed, so he decides to pick it up. You don't expect anyone to see him. He hears some noise and notices Dean Thomas. He sees the head of the hospital, who is conducting a dialogue as if he was behaving quite suspiciously with himself. Thomas is dragging a chained and bound woman on a stretcher, who just a few minutes ago went berserk and jumped out of the window along with Jessica. An ominous grin appears on the dean's face, indicating that the woman did a good job despite using a drug that was not intended to be used. Thomas picks up a syringe and decides to take some blood from the injured woman. He explains that he will take just a little blood from the patient, after which he will give her a sedative and send her to psychiatry. Holding a test tube with so much blood in his hand, he says that next time the mutation should cause a more beautiful effect, after which he puts that same sample of the mad girl's blood into a black box, which he takes with him. Finally, he looks around, being extremely careful so that no one witnesses what happened. Dr. Kevin turns out to be very lucky, and is surprised that he did not manage to catch the eye of the dean, feeling a strong interest in what exactly he just saw. After a short period of time, Kevin hands Christopher a package, saying that this is a gift especially for him. He smiles and says that this should be enough for him to recover from his injuries. The vampire hunter happily accepts the gift, thanking the doctor for the work he has done. Just about to leave, Dr. Kevin calls out to our main character, asking him to wait one more second. Surprised, Christopher turns around, deciding to clarify what exactly alarmed Kevin so much. The doctor closes his eyes for a second and wonders why exactly he called out to him and what he wants to say, trying to formulate his thoughts in his head. Having gained strength, he explains that the patient who fell out of the building, in his opinion, was in some incomprehensible state. Kevin decides to come in from afar, not to mention what he saw while in the office building, and for now it's better not to mention the head of the hospital, Thomas. Christopher thinks about the doctor's words, because it would really be impossible for an ordinary person to fall from such a height and not get hurt. He decides to clarify whether the doctor saw with his own eyes anything unusual or strange that is worth investigating. Kevin replies that he is very sorry, but he did not notice anything unusual, at this time thinking to himself that since the victims were not a vampire, he would conduct his own investigation. It also reminds you to remember to take care of your wounds after you leave the hospital. I don't fully understand what's going on. Kevin concludes that the patient's temperament has changed due to drug stimulation and also suggests that there are drugs that can turn people into vampires. Christopher also thinks that the situation looks very strange because the appearance of this woman is really suspicious. He suggests that this may be a new type of vampire. Jessica interrupts the thoughts of the men standing nearby by calling out to our main character and inviting him to go home together. The vampire hunter continues to insist that now is not the time to return home and that he still needs to look at the headquarters, with which the girl categorically disagrees, pointing out that he is now unable to continue working with his injuries. Christopher is slightly alarmed by the manifestation of such care and self-love, to which he cannot object a word. After a couple of seconds of hesitation, he still agrees, which causes Jessica to burst into laughter and joy. For a second, our heroine completely forgets about what is happening, remembering her promise to cook dinner. Approaching the door of our apartment, the heroes continue to discuss exactly what ingredients will be part of their dinner today. Christopher begins to go through the options for dishes in his head, fantasizing and imagining exactly how their dinner today will turn out. A discussion of our protagonist's favorite foods leads Jessica to conclude that his love of bloody meat makes him like a vampire. She also notes that eating foods high in iron after an injury will have a good effect on its recovery. Having opened the apartment door, Christopher immediately shields Jessica with himself, saying that they are not alone here and thieves could get in here. Supernatural abilities tell him that there is a vampire in the apartment, and a very strong one. A moment later, there is an explosion of firecrackers, and confetti and decorations fly everywhere. Our main character is somewhat confused about what is happening here. He sees his younger brother and Jessica's children in front of him, who begin to congratulate them. From the picture he saw, Christopher's vital forces leave him for some time, leaving him in a completely motionless state. At the same time, Jessica begins to listen to congratulations from her son and daughter on the holiday. Little Daisy immediately rushes into her mother's arms, talking about how much she loves her. Christopher comes to his senses after the shock he experienced and tries to understand why his younger brother is here and what holiday we are talking about. Little Connor at this moment expresses his dissatisfaction and asks why the vampire hunter came here because he spoils the whole atmosphere. The protagonist, who is in a stupor after such active events over the past few hours, still cannot understand what is happening. Meanwhile, Jacob decides to help his brother understand what is happening by explaining that today is Nurse's Day, and he and the children have prepared a surprise party. Joyful Jessica sees a chic table covered with a huge number of dishes on her face, which never leaves her smile. At this time, Jacob congratulates our heroine on the holiday, telling her to definitely try the cake that he baked especially for her. After such an eventful day, Jessica says that she is very happy with this surprise. At this moment, Jacob thinks about the fact that he received only gratitude, although, in his opinion, the human woman should have blushed. At this moment, her children rush into the arms of our birthday girl, saying that they also helped with preparing the surprise. Jessica smiles thanks to her children and says that she is very happy to see them safe and sound. At this moment, Jacob observes the whole situation, pondering the fact that he was clearly counting on a much more violent reaction towards himself. After which he looks at his brother, who, with a fixed gaze, does not show any emotions or signs of life. He offers to forget old grievances, at least for a second, by handing him a cup of tea and offering to cut the cake. Our main character repeats that he told his brother not to get close to Jessica and her children. The younger brother tries to explain that it was not his initiative, but little Connor and Daisy simply asked him for help. Jacob refers to the fact that even though he hates people, Jessica turned out to be a very interesting person for him. After which he says that he understood why his father got involved with this modest and beautiful woman who for a second flashes through his memories. Christopher can't stand it, and then grabs his brother by the tie with the desire to hit him again with all his might. With rage on his face, he warns Jacob never to speak his mother's name out loud, or mention her again. This situation is noticed by Jessica, who realizes that the conflict can escalate into a real fight. She decides to stop the two brothers by asking what exactly they didn't share and what's going on. Jacob grins, saying that if his brother is kicked out, he can do whatever he wants with the nurse. Then he asks to let him go and stop upsetting the birthday girl in the person of Jessica. Christopher understands the hopelessness of this situation, which is why he cannot do anything except agree with his brother. Jessica immediately decides to intervene, trying to calm the two brothers down and turn the quarrel into a peaceful direction. The vampire hunter at this moment does not know what to do, but they understand that the situation is again not in his favor. Still, having decided to calm down, he lets his brother go without causing him any harm. Our main character's brother tries to calm the girl down, saying that they were just chatting and nothing serious could happen. Jessica agrees with his statement, but a second later she is surprised to see something strange. She notices marks on the protagonist's armband from coffee stains that formed when he grabbed Jacob by the tie. She begins to insist that the bandage needs to be changed so that irritation does not start if the coffee suddenly reaches his wound. The protagonist's younger brother is completely ignored, causing obvious dissatisfaction to be seen on his face. Standing nearby, Connor decides to ask whether Jacob likes his mother. He pats the little boy on the head, asking him how confident he is that he can pursue his mother. I take this question seriously. He begins to think about how fast Mum can move. Then he replies that if he needs help, he can provide him with a service, but only tomorrow. At that very moment, a tight smile appears on Jacob's face, and he thanks the little boy for his help. After which he notices that his older brother is still stupid and does not understand that in order to win the favor of a single mother, one must first of all win the favor of her children. Jessica is trying to find something among the abundance of her things that will work as a replacement. She goes through all the abundance of her shirts and dresses, but cannot find what she is looking for at this time. Christopher stands silently and waits. After standing and thinking for a while, he expresses his dissatisfaction and reluctance to wear women's clothing. Just finishing rummaging through her things, almost at the very bottom of her closet, she finds an old white shirt. Turning to tell our main character about her discovery, incredible surprise appears on her face, and she blushes from her forehead to her chin. Standing in front of her is Christopher, who has decided to take off all his dirty, blood-stained clothes and also show off his muscles and aesthetics. He absolutely does not understand what is happening and why Jessica is so red. He decides to find out if she is sick and if she has a fever. She says that she is fine and then hands him the shirt she found and asks him to change. Jessica also takes the things that he has already taken off and goes to the laundry, saying that she will wash them. I'm about to open the door and leave the room when it is stopped by a sharp blow from the vampire hunter's palm. Our heroine was slightly frightened by such a drastic action and immediately decided to ask why he stopped her. He replies that she gave him a man's shirt, and where could it even come from in her apartment? In response to his question, he receives a reproach that, apparently, he wants to wear women's clothing and should not complain. Jessica says that women who live alone keep men's clothes in their homes to ward off bad guys and increase security, and that's completely normal. I also need to add that I used to put men's clothes and shoes at the entrance, but since I came here, I have removed them because there is good security here. She thinks to herself that she still hasn't decided to throw them away because someone can always come to her house and might need them. Our protagonist, stunned by this method of securing his home, is in a slight stupor but decides to agree and not ask any more questions. Jessica also thinks about the fact that if one of her work colleagues saw men's clothes in her house, they would most likely start gossiping about her boyfriend. She says that she is very sorry because she could not live up to his expectations and never wanted to fall in love and bring men to her home. And Christopher, standing behind her, hugs her and asks why. The main character says that no one wants love without a reason, but the two kids always wanted you to have someone who would take care of you and them. After a short pause hanging in the air, he gathers strength and asks her if she has been waiting to this day for their father to show up. Fearing that he might make her very angry, he still continues to supplement his previous question, clarifying a possible other reason for her loneliness. For a second, Jessica thinks about what reasons there may be, and worries that the identities of her children have been revealed, and this is just a provocation and an attempt to find out the truth. Such questions clearly seem not entirely appropriate to her, which is why the cry that Christopher should not meddle in her personal life can be heard in the living room where Jacob and her children are sitting. After which an angry girl with steam emanating from the room comes out of the room, as well as the main character with a visible slap mark on his left cheek. Christopher understands that such questions could not lead to anything good, and in order to win her favor, he needs to be more gentle and restrained. His brother immediately notices that he behaved tactlessly, and this is clearly not the way to woo a woman by offering himself as a teacher. He grabs his head, trying to comprehend what just happened and what nonsense he just said. He understands that everyone has their own personal opinion, and he just wants to control it and wants to know much more. Meanwhile, Jessica is sitting with her back to the washing machine, and her face clearly shows dissatisfaction with the current situation and the questions that they just tried to ask. She tries to calm down, saying to herself that everything is fine, and she herself invented all these suspicions regarding her children because there is absolutely no need to worry. She tries to beat up the jacket that Christopher gave her, presenting it to his, and trying to understand why he would so suddenly and inexplicably decide to ask such questions. She admits to herself that she really chose her clothing size based on her vague impression of the very man who should be the father of her children. After which she gently and carefully tries to catch the light aroma emanating from Christopher's jacket and notices that they smell the same. She is so immersed in herself and her thoughts that she does not notice Connor and Daisy appearing out of nowhere, who, looking at this whole picture, decide to ask what exactly their mother is doing. Out of surprise, Jessica explodes with an incredible scream, realizing in what position the children found her. She immediately puts the clothes into the washing machine, saying that there was nothing strange in her behavior because she was just looking for bloodstains on clothes. After looking at each other, the children understand that the situation looks rather strange, but they decide not to push and leave their mother alone. But nevertheless, they decide to come to an agreement among themselves. Connor offers to find a guy for their mother as soon as possible. Daisy agrees with him, saying that this mother's behavior cannot continue for too long. Meanwhile, somewhere in an underground laboratory, cries for blood are heard, and something strange has started. The underground laboratory is a scary, dark corridor with glass walls that serve as cells for prisoners. The head of the hospital, Thomas, passing by these cells, examines the experimental subjects in them who are trying to attack him. In one of the cells, he comes across a young woman who clearly shows no signs of life, and from his conclusions, it follows that she lived only 17 hours. He slowly and carefully examines camera after camera until his gaze stops at some more interesting specimen. He sees in front of him a young man with red hair, saying that among all the samples, he is the only one who has retained his sanity. The man in the cell looks at the doctor for a while and then asks to give him blood from the human body. Thomas opens the camera and starts playing with metaphors about the chef, asking the man to find the best ingredients himself. He invites the red-haired man to look into his red eyes and find a treat for himself. Meanwhile, somewhere at the police station, our main character continues his investigation into a recent incident. Our main character's assistant bursts into his office, saying that the analysis of the previously seized drug has arrived. He also claims that this drug is universal and has been found to rapidly improve human skills in the short term, but the high metabolic rate may have side effects. Christopher is trying to organize all his thoughts in his head and find connections between the evidence found, looking at the report on the mysterious drug. A few moments later, he asks his assistant to speak human language and explain everything in simpler words. Having thought everything over carefully, the assistant realizes that it would be better to say two simple words that the drug turns people into vampires. After the statement, the vampire hunter finally understands how all this can be connected. So the assistant notices that vampires created by this drug lose the ability to think and act completely like animals. Trying to analyze his words, Christopher recalls all the incidents involving vampires recently. He recalls the recent attacks on the supermarket by a group of vampires who were clearly acting abnormally, as well as the very woman who attacked Jessica. He asks his assistant about the presence of any other changes in people who have used the drug, for example, the composition of the blood and so on, in response receiving that the blood becomes similar to that of a vampire. The assistant also explains that within 24 hours they experience failure and die, but they have no evidence of whether anyone could survive after taking the drug. Christopher immediately orders to check the recent missing persons and make sure if anyone is from a group of crazy vampires. After which he immediately grabs the phone, dialing someone's number, while thinking about what the report said about a change in blood type, as well as the stench emitted by vampires. But recalling his impressions of that very incident, he compares the smell of a woman who smelled completely different from a vampire. Our main character calls the clinic and clarifies the condition of the woman who recently went crazy and whether everything is okay with her. Dr. Kevin, who answered the phone, replies that he is not in the hospital now, but just a few hours ago everything was fine with her, except for her emotional instability. Once again, I remember the data from the report, and the fact that the drug causes organ failure within 24 hours leads to the conclusion that the woman is not a vampire. Once again, I'm trying to think through all the information I've received. His thoughts are interrupted by a strange noise coming from the phone speakers. He catches Jessica's barely audible voice and decides to check with Kevin if he heard it. The doctor replies that today there is a sports day in the kindergarten for the whole family, including fathers, so Nurse Jessica asked him to be one. Before he could finish his sentence and ask a couple more questions, Kevin notices that Christopher suddenly hung up. Our main character was forced to hang up by a certain stupor after what he heard, as well as a misunderstanding of why Jessica chose the doctor and not him. You can clearly see anger on his face because, in his opinion, he is much more suitable for the role of Connor and Daisy's father. A second later, he remembers that he recently received a message on his phone and decides to immediately check its contents. This message turns out to be from little Connor, in which, the day before the event, he asks Christopher to pretend to be his dad. After reading the message, his assistant appears behind our protagonist, saying that the statistics will be available in a few days. As if not listening to him at all, Christopher rushes towards the exit of the police station with a tight smile on his face. The stunned assistant does not understand what is happening and decides to clarify, shouting after him that perhaps he has a new task and why he is leaving his workplace. He sees the enthusiasm and delight read on Christopher's face, trying to understand where he is in such a hurry. Meanwhile, at the kindergarten party, Jessica thanks Dr. Kevin for agreeing to help her, and also about the upcoming holiday dinner after the event. She also reports that she has prepared 2 types of cookies for the holiday dinner and decides to find out if the doctor likes blueberries. Kevin thanks her for her care and attentiveness, remembering that he once mentioned his passion for blueberries. Jessica notes that roll call will begin soon and they should hurry to the venue. Moving towards the reception, Jessica suddenly flinches and surprise is visible on her face. She sees her children having a nice conversation with the brother of our main character who appeared out of nowhere at the event. Jacob immediately decides to say hello and greet Jessica, complimenting her on how cute she looks in her workout clothes. I ask him why he ended up here. He replies that little Daisy sent a message asking for help, and he came because he was free. After which, Jacob notices Dr. Kevin and is slightly perplexed because the man standing behind the girl is also wearing sportswear. The doctor immediately decides to introduce himself, saying that he is a colleague of the nurse and is also here to act as a father. At this moment, the girl conducting the family roll call says into the microphone whether Connor and Daisy's father is here. At this moment, 3 proud and brave fathers, in the person of Christopher, his younger brother and Dr. Kevin, simultaneously say that I am here. Everyone present at the event, including themselves, falls into a stupor trying to understand how little children ended up with 3 fathers. Immediately, Jessica begins to experience excitement and slight shame from the fact that behind her back, a discussion is starting regarding the fact that her children have 3 dads at once. Not knowing how to get out of this situation, she just stands there, and the gossip continues to intensify. She's trying to go through options in her head on how to explain to everyone present how this could happen. At this moment, the same red-haired man from Dr. Thomas's laboratory is walking around the city. Passing by ordinary citizens, he tries to evaluate each of them. Seeing an old, grey-haired grandfather, he thinks that this is a dull guy. I notice a homeless man and a long-legged woman in front of me. He says that they are too dirty and their taste will be disgusting. Remembering the food metaphor Dr. Thomas gave him, he thinks that the ingredients must be the freshest and the purest. Moving a little further through the city, the man comes across a van with groceries being unloaded by several young guys. They say among themselves that all these vegetables and fruits were delivered for a children's party and will be prepared by the best chef. In parallel with this red-haired man, he notices a mother and daughter passing by, who are clearly in a hurry to go to the holiday. The girl explains to her mother that they need to hurry up because they are already very late due to the fact that her mother took too long to get ready. Looking at them, the red-haired man clearly has some insidious plan ripening in his head, and an ominous grin appears on his face. Meanwhile, Jessica chastises her children, saying that they are little troublemakers, and if they want to ask for help, they should discuss it with her first. Connor tries to defend himself, and his sister says that it was difficult for them to come up with all this and let their mother choose one loved one to be their father. Dissatisfaction is clearly visible on Jessica's face, causing her to make a strange grimace. The kids are trying to push for pity by saying that they don't want to see their mother working all the time and being completely alone, and it wouldn't hurt for her to get married. After which little Connor and Daisy begin to talk among themselves, discussing the pros and cons of each candidate present as their father. Jessica squats down next to her children, who immediately decide to clarify whether she is angry or not. She looks at her children, expressing understanding that they had good intentions, but this did not cause her much trouble, after which she presses them to her, saying that choosing a partner is a very difficult and lengthy process. She remembers Christopher from her children, while saying that everyone in the family should take care of each other. It also says that everyone should love each other and support each other in difficult times. As I finish my sentence, she shudders slightly, thinking about why, when thinking about all this, she remembers the vampire hunter in particular. Daisy says that they realized their mistake, but nevertheless, the event will begin soon, and they need to find out who will be in the role of father. She points her finger at the trio standing behind them, saying that it will be quite difficult to make a choice. Meanwhile, the organizer's girl warns the parents' children to take their places because the competition is about to begin. Thinking over the current situation once again, dissatisfaction is clearly visible on Jessica's face. She approaches 3 men who have gathered because of her and decides to talk to them. An inspired Jacob immediately intervenes in the conversation, asking who exactly she wants to choose and that he will try his best if the choice goes to him. Ignoring Jacob's statement, she looks at Christopher trying to find an excuse for the current situation. A sweet little smile appears on Jessica's face, and an apology comes from her lips that her 2 babies have caused so much trouble for everyone. Looking at all 3 of them, she once again mentions that she will apologize to everyone personally after the games are over. The vampire hunter tries to justify himself by saying that he had a day off and simply had nothing to do. After which Jessica, standing in front of the whole trio, grabs Dr. Kevin's hand, saying that she will bother him a little more. Kevin is slightly surprised and then thanks the girl, telling her that he will try very hard. Meanwhile, Christopher and Jacob stand in complete bewilderment, realizing that they are clearly superfluous here. The nurse, accompanied by the doctor, tries to leave as quickly as possible in order to avoid awkward situations. Our protagonist clearly doesn't like the current situation and, trying to contain his disappointment, stops Jessica with his scream. Then, looking at the dumbfounded couple, she asks why she chose Dr. Kevin and not him. She apologizes to him, says that she will treat him to a hearty dinner later, but inside, she hopes that he will not behave like a child again. Christopher's face clearly shows dissatisfaction with the current situation, and he is about to start a scandal, when suddenly his speech is abruptly interrupted by something, and he feels the aroma of blood in the air. He realizes that things are taking a completely different turn, and not listening to what Jessica is trying to tell him, turns around and leaves. Meanwhile, our heroine decides that this behavior can clearly be connected with his resentment and feels depressed. Jacob clearly manages to realize the same thing as his brother, and says that he too will have to leave a little early. He tells them both not to worry about them and that he will look forward to her promised hearty dinner. Meanwhile, our main character follows the scent of blood that he recently smelled, reasoning that his intuition does not let him down. He sees in front of him that same food van with the door closed, from which comes the bright aroma of blood. Opening the door of our van, the protagonist sees the bodies of workers stacked inside the van. At this time, Jacob catches up with him. I notice the situation that happened and feel real surprise at how this could happen. Analyzing the wounds received by the victims, Christopher understands that the blood was not completely sucked out, and this is just an ordinary murder. Based on 2 small marks on the neck, he concludes that the criminal is clearly a vampire. In turn, the protagonist's brother notes that it was a waste of blood because the vampire practically did not suck it out. Christopher immediately grabs his brother by the neck, pinning him against the door of the van and asking why he did it. Jacob notes that his brother knows his taste well, and he would not drink the guy's blood. Besides, he was next to him all this time. Christopher says that his brother is not the kind of guy who attacks people just to fill his stomach, and this is all a provocation. Jacob nudges his hand, grinning at the fact that he is trying to make him look like a provocateur. He pokes his finger into our protagonist's jacket, claiming that if he wanted to engage in provocation, he would go to the headquarters of the vampire hunters, threatening that he would suck the blood out of every police officer and hang their bodies in the most visible places throughout the station. At that very second, rage boils inside Christopher, causing him to momentarily decide to turn into a vampire, saying that he should have killed his brother much earlier. His intention is interrupted by a woman standing nearby who observed everything that was happening. The two brothers immediately fall into a stupor. I don't understand how they didn't notice that someone was watching them. A woman standing in front of a police car immediately begins screaming that a murder has occurred. Two police officers find themselves in the car and manage to hear the woman's cries for help. Christopher grabs his head with his hand, closing his eyes, realizing that this incident will drag on for a very long time. Two police officers immediately get out of the car. One of them points a pistol at the brothers, warning them that if anything happens, they will open fire. Jacob immediately raises his hands, reproaching his brother for the fact that the vampire could still be somewhere nearby. He notices that this car is delivering food to a kindergarten, and he heard that there is a banquet planned after the event. Putting two and two together, our main character realizes that a vampire could get inside the building and he needs to hurry. Christopher begins to move towards the police, simultaneously putting his hand into his jacket, from which he clearly wants to get his ID. The two police officers decide that his intentions are clearly unfriendly and he is going to pull out a weapon. The main character immediately tries to justify himself by saying that there are documents in his pocket and they shouldn't worry about anything. After the words he said, a charged electrode from a shocker immediately rushes in his direction. Unfortunately, Christopher does not have time to react to the shot, causing the stun gun to hit him directly in the hand. After being hit, he is immediately struck by an electric shock, from which he can no longer stand on his feet and falls face down into the ground. At this time, Jacob, standing nearby, is clearly surprised by what is happening, but all he can do is stand and laugh. They put handcuffs on Christopher, and without listening to his cries that he has documents, they try to take him to the police station. At this time, the brother standing next to him looks back towards the kindergarten building, saying that, in his opinion, everything has already begun. You understand that the police are busy with his brother. He decides to check who dared to act behind his back. At this time, Jessica, accompanied by Dr. Kevin, as well as the rest of the parents, are waiting for the end of the event. After the competition ends, they see in front of them a luxurious banquet hall with various decorations. At this time, one of the organizing girls says that today's event ends and the promised banquet begins. Everyone present, including the parents' children, is presented with a birthday cake. Jessica is still thinking about the situation, trying to understand why our protagonist simply turned around and ran away, suggesting that he might have been offended. Dr. Kevin, sitting opposite, brings her to her senses by saying that the event is still not over and she needs to be more concentrated. She asks why Kevin didn't even touch the treats, only to hear that he ate before the event and wasn't hungry. I also remember that I'm looking forward to those promised homemade blueberry cookies with great impatience. After some time, panic begins to arise in the hall. Our heroes notice that the doors and windows are locked, suggesting some kind of secret concert program. Our heroes also notice that all the children and parents present in the room begin to behave strangely. They feel dizzy and feel ill. At the same second, Jessica herself begins to feel ill, dizzy, and loses consciousness. Dr. Kevin manages to grab the falling girl, while at the same time trying to find out what is happening to her. Meanwhile, the same red-haired guy appears in the room, saying that the doctor's drug is quite effective. He grabs a small defenseless girl, saying that livestock to be slaughtered will secrete large amounts of lactic acid due to fear of death. He brings the little girl's neck to his mouth, intending to plunge the fangs protruding from his mouth into her. Still in the making, Jessica manages to notice the commotion of this very man, saying that he is a vampire. At this time, watching as one of the vampire's fangs begins to slowly pierce the little girl's neck. Suddenly, a ceramic mug manages to fly into the bloodsucker's forehead, saving the little girl from certain death. The vampire notices that this same mug was thrown by a man standing nearby, who is Dr. Kevin. He is amazed that an ordinary mortal man had the audacity and courage to do such a thing. The doctor tells Jessica that he can distract him, and she and the children should get out of here as soon as possible. At this moment, the vampire makes a lightning dash towards the doctor with the intention of killing him. Kevin manages to react and grab the bloodsucker attacking him, preventing himself from being wounded. After which, holding the offender by the shoulders, he makes a sharp turn with his body and throws him over his hip. A moment later, the vampire finds himself lying on the ground with the doctor behind him. Poor Jessica at this moment is trying to cope with the effects of the drug, realizing that she must call for help. At the same time, looking around and trying to understand where her little children are. She is trying to find a way to get out of this state and come to her senses when she notices a fork lying on the table. She grabs it in her hands, saying that this is the only option that can have the desired effect. Having gathered all her will into a fist, she thrusts the fork into her chest with all her might, experiencing extreme pain, and blood begins to ooze from the wound. This action clearly has an effect, after which Jessica gets to her feet and begins to look for her children. She lifts the tablecloth of one of the tables to find a frightened Connor and Daisy underneath. For a second, her gaze clouds, after which a slight horror appears on her face from the fact that something is clearly wrong with her children. She sees fear and despair in the eyes of her children, and that their hands and clothes are stained with blood. She realizes that in the current turmoil, with many injuries including herself and that little girl, her children are beginning to lose control. The smell of a lot of blood in the air makes her children lose their minds, and they need to get out of here as soon as possible. Holding the children close to her, Jessica forgets about her wound with a fork, which makes Daisy standing next to her even more thirsty. Little Daisy begins to panic and slowly lose control, and her mother tries her best to calm her down. At this time, Dr. Kevin continues to distract the vampire by trying to resist him. The red-haired bloodsucker grabs the doctor by the head and throws him towards the wall with railings. Kevin hits his head against the wall with all his might, causing him to briefly lose consciousness, and his face is covered with bloody stains and glass shards from broken glasses. The bloodsucker will lose his hands. They say that it was an annoying waste of time, and it's time for a pleasant meal. When suddenly little Daisy, out of control and full of rage, rushes right into his face. She flies up to his face, making a sharp swing and striking his shocked and surprised face with her right hand. Jessica, kneeling nearby, is trying with all her might to stop her daughter, begging her to take her back. Jessica begs her daughter not to turn into a monster, while she manages to bite the offender on the ear, after which he manages to take control of his own body for a second and take a few steps back. The bloodsucker, clearly upset by this situation, tries to catch the little girl, but Daisy's agility and dexterity prevent him from doing this. Little Daisy licks her bloody finger since she managed to wound the vampire by scratching half of his face. Shocked by what he saw, the bloodsucker looks at the girl with horror and realizes that a real little vampire is standing in front of him. This moment of confusion gives Jessica the opportunity to take control of the situation. She grabs a fork in her hand, which helped her come to her senses, and is about to stab the vampire from behind. Making a sharp swing, she sticks the fork into the back of the unsuspecting bloodsucker with all her might. After which, Jessica takes advantage of a second of confusion and tries to save her daughter. Jessica grabs her daughter with all her strength, hugging her to her and praying for her to come to her senses. Love, care, and the warmth of her mother's body help little Daisy return to her senses. At this time, an angry vampire, who managed to recover after being hit with a fork, attacks a defenseless girl and her mother, intending to take revenge. Suddenly, a loud explosion occurs, and a gap begins to be visible in one of the walls, the same protection that blocked all the windows and doors. At the same second, Jessica and her frightened daughter manage to notice a vampire hunter appearing out of nowhere. Christopher manages to perform a lightning-fast kick with all his might, knocking the bloodsucker down. Having fallen to the floor, the vampire, stunned by the situation, drops a jar with the same drug on the floor. Christopher manages to notice that, for a moment, he smelled another vampire as soon as he entered the room. He notices that the vampire's scent has suddenly disappeared, and a strange aroma emanates from this guy. At this time, Jessica hides behind one of the tables, realizing that she cannot allow the hunter to find out the truth about her daughter and should get out of here as soon as possible. At that same second, Jessica's mouth is covered by someone's palm, from which she, in fright, does not have time to utter even one sound. The person whose hand covered the girl's mouth turns out to be Jacob, who had been hiding under one of the tables all this time. At this time, the red-haired vampire realizes that he has encountered a hunter and is incredibly lucky. He decides to take one of the people as a hostage and run away while he has time. He runs up to one of the tables, pulling the tablecloth off it in the hope of finding one of the parents or children. He sees the main character's brother frighten Jessica and her children. Hoping for an easy prey, he already manages to swing his arms, trying to seize one of them as a hostage. He is immediately stopped by Christopher, who grabs his hand, preventing him from accomplishing his plan. Inexplicably, the red-haired man manages to wriggle out and dodge the vampire hunter's grasp. The bloodsucker, having escaped from the grip, tries to find a way out as soon as possible and escape from the crime scene. He manages to notice the same gap in the wall left by Christopher and jumps into it outside the building. The surprised protagonist tries to understand how he managed to escape from his grip. For a second, his thoughts are interrupted by a child's scream behind him, and he decides to look around. He sees a frightened Jessica behind him, as well as little Connor and Daisy, behind whom is his brother. Jacob immediately points out that his brother should hurry up because the criminal may escape. Christopher also manages to notice the puncture wound on Jessica's chest. He decides to set his priorities right by warning everyone present that the doctors and police will be here soon. Jessica is unable to utter even the slightest word, and all she can do is be close to her children. The only thing she can think about at the moment is that I'm incredibly lucky because her children are safe, and her daughter's secret remains a secret. Jacob also looks at us, smiles at him, and says thank you for protecting them. He thinks about just worrying about his prey, but notices that it's nice to be appreciated. Jacob also wipes the remaining blood from Daisy's face, saying that they are safe and sound. A moment later, he manages to notice a jar of the drug lying nearby, which the red-haired vampire managed to drop. The thought immediately flashes through his head that his suspicions from the involvement of third parties in these events are justified. Meanwhile, Christopher chases with all his might and tries to catch up with the intruder. I understand that this cannot be delayed. He grabs a brick lying on the road. Then he takes aim and makes a sharp swing with his hand in order to throw him straight at the criminal. After an accurate throw, the brick rushes forward with a targeted hit, catching the back of the red-haired bloodsucker's head. Such a hit clearly stuns, and at the same time knocks down the fleeing intruder. Approaching closer to the vampire, Christopher notices that he runs very quickly and also rips out of the ground a wooden sign standing nearby. He moves towards the bloodsucker, holding in his hand the pointer he tore out, mentioning how he had the courage to hurt Jessica and her children. The vampire lying on the ground is clearly not in the best position, after which the vampire hunter crushes him with his boot. A moment later, the rage boiling inside Christopher takes over, and with all his might he thrusts the tip of the pointer straight into the vampire's chest. On the face of our protagonist, one can clearly see indescribable anger and a desire to finish off the offender right on the spot. You understand that you can't kill a vampire. He takes the phone and calls a research group to the scene to apprehend the vampire. The vampire lying on the ground says that he realized that all this was for the sake of that woman and for her safety. He asks, looking into Christopher's eyes, how their headquarters would react if they found out that their hunter was protecting a vampire for the sake of this woman. Christopher doesn't understand what he's talking about, suspects that he means his brother, and is advised to forget about this problem. After which the vampire presses the pointer pin protruding from his chest even more strongly and begins to writhe in pain. He orders him to lie still and not move until the cleanup team arrives, after which they can talk in a more secluded place. Magically, the vampire finds the strength to stand up, throw himself off the hunter's leg, and pull the pin out of his chest. After which he tries to run away with the last strength in his body so as not to fall into the hands of the police. He succeeds with difficulty, since his body is not in the most suitable state for escape due to the injuries and wounds he received. The stunned vampire hunter tries to stop him, saying that he is only making things worse for himself. I make a desperate decision, and the red-haired guy jumps over the fence of a canal located not far from them. The main character, being in a complete stupor, looks at the nameless surface of the water, along which waves disperse from the splash of the bloodsucker falling into it. His assistant immediately appears behind him, who asks where the vampire he captured has gone. Christopher immediately informs him that he managed to jump over the fence and jumped into the river. He also points out that the criminal's blood remains on the ground, and that it should be collected for further study. Our protagonist gives instructions to search everything along the river because the criminal had a huge number of injuries, and he will not be able to run far. For a second, he wonders how the vampire got so many abrasions and bruises. Could someone have caused so much damage before his intervention? And was it an ordinary person? After some time, the police and ambulance arrive at the scene, and all the victims are in stable condition. In Jessica's arms are the sleeping Daisy, who is completely exhausted after her battle with the vampire. She recalls that for the first time she was able to see her daughter in such a state, and hoped that no one else had time to notice it except her. Jacob, who is nearby, tries to calm the girl down by saying that the vampire has already been taken care of. She decides to ask him if he saw something when she and her brother burst inside. Surprised, Jacob asks what exactly he was supposed to see. not understanding what he was talking about. The girl smiles sweetly, trying to change the topic and say if he saw the other wounded. He reassures her by telling her not to worry about anything because the vampire did not harm anyone. I propose to take her home with her children. Meanwhile, they are noticed by Christopher, who has been communicating with the police all this time. Jessica carries Daisy, who is sleeping in her arms, towards the car, and her brother Jacob, walking behind her, drags Connor behind him. Christopher, not wanting to let them go alone, decides to call out to Jessica, loudly shouting her name into the air. I understand the state she and the children are in, and he offers to personally take them home. She replies that he still has a lot of work to do, and he should stay here, and his brother will take them home. Standing next to him, Jacob just grins, realizing that his brother's idea was a failure. He also notes that it is not surprising that the nurse has such an attitude towards her brother, because he does not have any gentlemanly manners. He accuses his brother of first leaving the girl without saying a word, and then simply leaving with the vampire when she was injured. In parting, Jacob says that he will take care of her, and he can return to his business of exterminating vampires. Stunned by so many insults, our main character does not even have time to object to his brother's statement. He stands there in thought, trying to create the words his brother said, and find excuses for them in his head. He beats up an escaped vampire found by the police, trying to get at least some information out of him, and at the same time, vent his anger. He is trying to understand why Jessica is so negligent and cold about everything he tries to warn her about, without taking into account his good intentions. The vampire hunter turns to his assistant, saying to take the still-breathing vampire and try to extract at least some information from him. The main character's assistant immediately puts handcuffs on the vampire, while simultaneously wondering what's wrong with our boss today. After some time, being in his soul, Christopher thinks that Jessica's behavior was caused by the fact that he did not protect her well enough. He worries that she, not understanding what a whirlpool of danger she is in, is trying to resist his protection. He doesn't know what to do in this situation because he can't be with her all the time. There are moments when she eats, sleeps, works, and so on. Jessica, who has returned home a long time ago, puts her small children to bed. Jessica looks at them with very pitiful eyes, realizing the horror they had to experience today. She once again thinks about the safety of her children, realizing that Christopher, who is a vampire hunter, is trying to get too close to her. Jessica hears a knock on the door, rushing to open it and wondering who could come to her at such a late hour. Approaching the door and opening it, she sees in front of her the silhouette of a tall, red-haired man. A second later, I understand who is standing in front of her and decide to ask him what he needed so late. Standing in front of her door, Christopher asks if he can stay overnight with her. Jessica's gaze is filled with obvious dissatisfaction, and the thought flashes through her head. Why did he suddenly want to stay in her house? Did he really discover that something was wrong? Our protagonist is trying to explain that nothing fundamentally important happened, and the pipes just burst in his house. Jessica looks around, noticing a raging stream of water in front of her apartment. The main character, trying to portray a small, harmless puppy, presses for pity, saying that he had been fighting vampires all day and was very tired. At this moment, dissatisfaction is clearly visible on Jessica's face. She clenches her teeth and thinks to herself how he is trying to make her look guilty. But after some time of thinking, she smiles and says that he can stay in their living room for one night. I accompany him into the living room. She thinks that in any case, this is just for one night, and her children are in a stable condition. Christopher lies down on his pillow, thinking that if they lived together, he could protect them at any time. Realizing that everything is in order, she leaves Jacob alone and goes to sleep in her room. Looking after each other, each of them thinks about his own. Jessica, that you are talking about him in the morning, and Christopher, that he will bring his luggage in the morning. The next morning, Kenora wakes up and Daisy rushes to the kitchen to say hello to their mother. Their morning confusion instantly dissipates, and their gaze stumbles upon something strange in the kitchen. They are carrying Christopher and his mother standing in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, and at the same time discussing that the kindergarten is closed today due to yesterday's events. Stunned by what they saw, they glance at each other, trying to understand how it all happened. Meanwhile, Christopher begins to slowly eat his breakfast, and Jessica tries to stop him, telling him not to steal food. Little Daisy runs into the arms of her hunter uncle, and Connor wonders if Mom has finally made a choice. Christopher takes the little girl in his arms and promises to play with her after they all have breakfast together. Jessica, feeling embarrassed, persuades her daughter not to pester her uncle because he needs to return home after breakfast and fix the water pipe. At this moment, Christopher tells Daisy that the pipe repair can wait, and he will definitely play with her, which makes Jessica clearly unhappy. She suspects that the vampire hunter is clearly planning something bad, and why is he not going to rush back to his apartment? Meanwhile, little Connor tugs at his mother's dress, asking her if she really chose this strange uncle as our dad. While I'm a little boy, trying to figure out which of the candidates for the role of his father is best suited, laughing Jessica tries to justify herself and say that he is wrong. Meanwhile, Connor, as if not hearing what his mother is telling him, comes up to Christopher and says that being their dad is not so easy. He stands against the backdrop of a worried mother, trying to put forward a list of requirements that their father should have. He also begins to list Jessica's shortcomings, saying that his mother is a very nervous person and often loses her things. She forgets to take her medications when she is sick, and often forgets to eat when she works late. He cites all this as examples that their future father will have to put up with. Daisy, sitting in the arms of the main character, also notices that their mother likes to be brave, because one day she and her brother got sick, and their mother did not sleep all night, and the next day she went to work. They continue their speech by emphasizing that Mom is very strong and never allows herself to be helped, and also has poor orientation and forgets the way. After everything he heard, Christopher decides to calm the kids down, saying that he will remind their mother to take her medicine, when she gets sick, bring her a snack, and will always protect her and take care of her. Standing in complete bewilderment, Jessica looks at this picture and hears the words that she will be looked after and always taken care of as if she were her children. After hearing the words, little Daisy begins to laugh and smile, and then tries to hug our main character tightly. After a moment, Christopher looks at Jessica, saying out loud that he doesn't know if their mother will agree to him taking care of her children and herself full-time. The stunned girl falls into a complete stupor after hearing what she hears. Her face becomes filled with blood and becomes covered with a slight pinkness. After which Jessica begins to rapidly rush around the apartment in search of her mobile phone. She immediately calls property management and asks why the plumber hasn't come yet. At this time, little Connor looks at his frightened mother, indicating that his words that she may have nervous breakdowns are true. He realizes that he was too hasty with his answer. Our main character looks at him and reluctantly agrees with him. After some time, a plumber arrives at our protagonist's apartment and says that, apparently, something is stuck in the pipe. He saws off a piece of pipe and then begins to use his hands to look for the cause of the breakdown due to flooding. After a few seconds, he pulls out a black towel from the pipe, pointing at it and saying that it was the one that caused the problem. And after a few more moments, a stream of amazing and incomprehensible objects that ended up in the drain pipe begins to fall out of the pipe. Our heroes look at everything that is happening, completely perplexed as to how it all ended up there. Jessica decides to clarify how difficult it will be to fix this breakdown, to which the plumber replies that he is a professional and will quickly manage it. While they were standing and talking, an unexpected explosion was heard behind them. Turning around, the plumber sees a crippled pipe and Christopher standing next to him as if nothing had happened. He looks at the mangled pipe, trying to assess the extent of the damage and how long it will take to repair. The vampire hunter looks at the pipe and they say that apparently it was also old and began to leak here. Meanwhile, Connor and Daisy eavesdrop on the adults' conversation, managing to realize that replacing the main pipe will take at least a few days, and Christopher better move out for a while. Our protagonist at that very moment decides to start asking Jessica to spend the night for a few days, and at that very moment she interrupts him by saying no. She says that if it takes a long period of time, he should move to a hotel. At this moment, Daisy calls out to her and shows her a toy doll with Christopher's face. She shows her mother the vampire hunter's work ID and says that she tore out the photograph from it and glued it in place of the doll's face. Connor, in turn, points to the toilet and says that he accidentally flushed something that looked like a bank card into it. They both look at their mother with very pitiful eyes of two kittens, saying that they made a mistake because of which Uncle, apparently, will not be able to go to the hotel. Dissatisfaction is clearly visible on Jessica's face, and Christopher at this moment winks at the kids, implying that they did everything right. He explains to their children that everything is fine and he is not angry with them, but next time they better not do this. Clearly unhappy with what is happening, Jessica becomes very angry and asks why her children are so irresponsible. She hugs her children, thinking that if Christopher had not been a vampire hunter, her children would not be in danger. A thought slips into Jessica's head in which our main character, having learned the secret that her children are vampires, simply kills them. Holding Connor and Daisy tightly to her chest, she thinks that she cannot allow this to happen, and cannot allow two kids to face even the slightest danger. Christopher clarifies how the profession of a vampire hunter relates to the safety of her children. Having caught herself, Jessica realizes that she may have said something wrong, and Christopher may suspect something is wrong. At this time, our protagonist himself comes up with an answer to his own question, saying that his work is often in danger, and that is why she worries about her children. Approaching her, our main character tries to calm her down by saying that she has been through a lot lately, and that is why she should rely on him. He assures that he will make every effort to protect and keep her and her children from danger. At this moment, a phone call is heard on his phone, and he asks for forgiveness because he urgently needs to answer. Jessica calms down, suspecting that he did not understand who her children really are, and there is nothing to worry about. She stands waiting for the vampire hunter to receive orders from his superiors over the phone. He turns around and says that he has urgent matters and needs to come to headquarters, and he can return in the evening. Jessica immediately decides to object to what the phrase means that he will return later, because she has not yet given consent for him to live in her apartment. Trying once again to act like our little one, the protagonist covers his ears and tries to run away to work as quickly as possible, saying that he doesn't hear anything. Our heroine once again looks after him, wondering how a person engaged in such a dangerous craft can behave like this. But he still decides to worry first about his children and check if everything is okay with them. She looks at Connor and Daisy, deciding to ask them if they would like to move to another place in the near future. Tears begin to well up in the eyes of the little girl. She tries to convince her mother that she really likes it here and really likes the kindergarten she goes to, as well as Uncle Christopher and his younger brother. Connor says that he is tired of constantly moving, and as soon as he tries to make friends with someone, they immediately have to part. Jessica realizes what a stupid thing she just said and decides to immediately apologize to her children. Thoughts about the safety of her family worry her most, and she once again wonders whether Christopher poses a threat to her children. Jessica wonders if her fears could be due to her excessive anxiety, and maybe she should trust the vampire hunter a little more. Meanwhile, our protagonist finds himself at the scene of another incident. He's trying to determine where the aroma of the blood he found nearby from the crime scene comes from. His assistant runs up to him from behind and reports that they have already searched many places, but the vampire has not been found. Christopher reports that the vampire may be hiding, so they need to expand the search area. He wonders why Jessica is so involved in recent incidents involving vampires. Then she introduces all the sinister personalities who have been in contact with her lately. He doesn't understand why this woman is so negligent about her safety and doesn't even allow him to stay next to her. While his mind is baffled by his thought processes, he is interrupted by his assistant with new information. Without allowing him to say this word, Christopher asks what a real man who is in a woman's house should do. This question clearly stuns his assistant, as well as all his colleagues and police officers present at this search event. Christopher immediately tries to run away from the question, and his assistant is touched to the depths of his soul by saying that a piece of ice in the captain's soul has begun to slowly melt. After some time, the head of the hospital, Thomas, sits in his chair and looks at some documents. Suddenly, an ampoule with the very drug that the red-haired vampire dropped appears on the table in his office. Jacob immediately appears behind him and asks where he got it from. Realizing the negligent attitude towards his work, he immediately grabs Thomas by the head and hits the table with all his might. He asks if the bottle of the drug seems familiar to Thomas and how it ended up in his hands. He mentions that he asked Thomas not to interfere with his fun, but he dared to extend his hand to him. After which he tries to threaten Thomas by saying that he does not take him seriously. He tries to make excuses to Jacob, saying that it was an accident, and the experimental vampire managed to escape. They also say that this was done for the sake of the prosperity of the entire clan. Jacob lets Thomas in, saying that he hasn't heard such a disgusting remark in a long time. Jacob looks up at the full moon, wondering where vampires are on the food chain, asking Thomas whether he believes that vampires need prosperity, or is it just his imagination. He smiles and says never to hear such things come out of his mouth again. He also warns Thomas for the last time not to dare to pry into his affairs and also to interfere with his fun. The head of the hospital replies that he understood everything and will not dare to let or disappoint the young master again. After Jacob leaves the office, Thomas begins to get angry, reproaching him for allowing himself too much because of his superior vampire bloodline. He picks up a bottle of the drug and says that when the era of vampires comes, his hands will be untied and he will be able to do whatever he wants. He also wonders if the red-haired experimental vampire is still alive. Why hasn't he returned yet? Later that evening, Jessica is in the kitchen preparing dinner for herself and her children. She remembers the situation that happened this afternoon and how Christopher simply ran off to work without explaining anything. Our heroine is trying to guess what will happen if she doesn't let him into her house and whether there is a possibility that he will remain sleeping on the street. Her head once again begins to be tormented by thoughts that her children may be in danger, and she will not allow him to stay here in any case. Jessica is so immersed in her thoughts and cooking dinner that she doesn't notice the real Daisy behind her. A little girl decides to ask her mother why they are having such strange dishes for dinner today. Connor, at this moment, is sitting at the table and looking at the terrible and red dishes prepared by her mother. Jessica finds herself accidentally cooking all of the vampire hunter's favorite dishes. Jessica smiles at her children and says she just decided to experiment a little. She takes the prepared dishes from the table, saying that she grieves for their stray dogs and will prepare something else, while thinking about what a strong influence Christopher has on her. Meanwhile, having dealt with all the affairs at the station, Christopher returns home, not thinking that he will be delayed so long. Approaching the house and looking at Jessica's apartment, he sees the sign "Please do not enter." A water pipe has burst. Looking at the time on his phone, he realizes that the children have been sleeping for a long time, and most likely he can wake them up if he starts knocking on the door. He decides to sit on the floor near the door with his back against the wall and just spend the night sitting on the street. Suddenly, his thoughts are interrupted by a small white note that squeezes between the door and the wall. The note, presumably written by little Daisy, states that the spare key is on the doorframe and food is in the kitchen. Looking at such a sweet message, a smile appears on Christopher's face and he begins to laugh. I understand how bad a disguise this is. He perfectly remembers the handwriting of the two kids and unravels the cunning plan of Jessica, who wrote this note with her own left hand, trying to imitate the child's handwriting. He carefully takes out the spare key and quietly opens the front door without any sudden movements. There is a local silence in the apartment because all the residents, including Jessica and her children, have been sleeping for a long time. Walking a little further into the kitchen, Christopher notices a dinner on the table from the very dishes that Jessica promised to throw out to her children. Incredibly inspired, he is surprised that all the dishes that he loves so much are on the table. Meanwhile, Jessica, standing around the corner, is worried about how kind she is and cannot bring herself to push the person out the door. She goes to bed, leaving herself to be very careful so that he doesn't find out the secret of the two kids. After so many days filled with a huge number of events, they do not go to bed peacefully and quietly. Before he can fall asleep, Christopher is disturbed by the silhouette of a man approaching his bed, which he does not immediately manage to make out. For some reason, he suddenly decides to assume that this Jessica decided to come to his bed at night. It is not clear why he begins to feel shy, saying that it is too early for them to do such things. But still, after a couple of moments, common sense overtakes his mind, and he stops acting like a child. He decides to sit up and look around, seeing little Connor and Daisy in his bed. He blushes at how stupid the thought was in his head at the very beginning, and also remembering that children have a habit of walking at night. Through his sleep, he hears Daisy's light and trembling muttering, trying to make out at least one word. Snuggled up to Christopher's chest in the form of his beautiful son, little Daisy says that Uncle Hunter is her dad. He decides not to wake up the little children and goes to bed with them, preparing to really become a real father for the little girl. The next morning, Christopher slowly begins to move his belongings to Jessica's apartment. Unpacking suitcases, little Connor and Daisy are very interested in helping him organize his things. Connor decides to help move all the documents onto the desktop first, since he is guilty of flushing some of them down the toilet. Christopher understands that he alone was involved in his move much more, and even such minor help is very useful. Jessica, also busy with the moving process, calmly exhales, realizing that because of her good nature, she finally allowed him to move. She notices that quite a long time has passed since they had such excitement in their house, and it's quite pleasant. Despite her feet, she begins to lose her balance, stumbling, and is about to drop the box she is holding in her hand. A moment before the fall, Christopher manages to save the girl by grabbing the box in his hands. He says that she no longer needs to carry heavy boxes herself because there is now a man in the house. He also remembers that he promised the two kids that he would take care of their mother. Jessica clearly did not expect such bold and kind words addressed to her, which once again begins to smile and blush. Meanwhile, the kids look at the photo album once again and notice something strange in it. They manage to look through almost all of their family photos, including those where they are and their mother is. Then they realize with horror that there is not a single family photo in their photo album. They immediately start screaming and trying to convince Jessica to come with them and take a family photo. Confused, Jessica says they already had family photos and why they want to take them again. Concerned children say that there is no dad in their family photos and that they should all take a photo together. Jessica tries to explain that the vampire hunter will be here for a while and they shouldn't take any photos. Our protagonist decides to take matters into his own hands, saying that two kids are right and living under one roof makes them a family. After which, in an instant, he grabs little Daisy in his arms, manages to change into a suit and says that they need to take a family photo. Concerned, Jessica has no choice but to agree with the decision of the majority and go to the shopping center. After some time in the photo studio, the photographer working there says that this family has an excellent sense of style. Looking at them, he lists that he took a huge number of photographs of families, but the photographs of his father and mother look best. Jessica begins to ask whether such photographs are needed, to which little Daisy says that she saw these while visiting her friend. Christopher stands at this moment and tries to say with a calm face that he has no problems with fulfilling the children's wishes. Our heroine understands that she has already caved in too many times to the decisions of others, so she decides once again to agree and not be stubborn. She dresses in a chic white dress like a real royal princess, and in her hands are a bouquet of lush pink flowers. Everyone present, including Christopher's children, are simply stunned by how beautiful their mother looks. The photographer watching this whole scene begins to cry, saying that he has never met a more ideal couple in his life. Our heroes, in the costume of the bride and groom, begin to pose and follow all the instructions of the photographer. Jessica wonders for a moment that she's never even had a wedding before and will somehow end up in this situation. Looking at Christopher, she feels like her heart is about to explode and her excitement knows no bounds. The photographer notes that he doesn't look like a young couple who just fell in love with each other, and they should be more intimate in family photos. Little Connor and Daisy understand what they are talking about, grabbing their parents' legs and pushing them towards each other. Jessica and Christopher, obviously, not expecting such an act on the part of their children, stumble and succumb to provocation. After such an action on the part of Connor and Daisy, they randomly merge in a tender and at the same time passionate kiss. Realizing what is happening, Jessica immediately begins to run away completely, covered in red spots, screaming that she is very sorry. Christopher manages to stop her, placing his gentle hands on her beautiful and at the same time shy face. He turns her towards him and without outside help kisses her tender lips. Jessica can't help but think that this is all sheer madness and the vampire hunter has gone crazy. The photographer clearly enjoys the situation and is completely engrossed in the photographs. Meanwhile, Connor and Daisy are considering the next step, which clearly should be a marriage between their mother and the hunter. Sometime later, the next day, Jessica, while at work, notices that she has received a message on her phone. The message she received turns out to be from the same photographer who asks Jessica to publish some of the pictures in his studio. The girl does not have time to notice the nurses standing behind her with glowing eyes, saying that it will be difficult to explain if someone sees such photographs. One of the nurses immediately begins to wonder, with incredible desire in her eyes, what photographs we are talking about and why they cannot be shown. Stunned, Jessica immediately jumps up in place from the realization that her entire cunning plan has failed miserably. She starts making excuses, trying to explain that she doesn't have a boyfriend, and all these messages are just a mistake. When asked by a fellow nurse why she is so nervous, she begins to come up with even more stupid excuses, becoming covered in beads of sweat. After which she tries to escape from the scene as quickly as possible, saying that she has urgent matters. Dr. Kevin, who is in a hospital bed and sees that guests have visited him, decides to ask if she is feeling better. Jessica, who entered the room, says that everything is fine with her and that the fork she received early doesn't hurt anymore. She tries to apologize for the incident that happened at the kindergarten and that he had to risk his life to protect her and the children. Kevin replies that his only regret is that he didn't get to try the blueberry cookies. Jessica is embarrassed that he still remembers that same cookie, saying that she just has it with her today. After which, with a joyful look, He says that he will return soon and he should wait a little. While Jessica is away, Kevin notices that she left her cell phone there. Deciding to look into it, he sees a message from that same photographer, as well as a sample photograph of her and Christopher. Kevin was completely dumbfounded when he saw the photograph, because he clearly did not expect such an outcome of events. Jessica immediately returns to the room with a joyful look and says that she brought cookies and freshly squeezed juice. Naz looks at Kevin asking why his expression looks so serious. A moment later, she looks around his bed and notices that she left her phone there. She tries to collect her phone with the hope that he did not have time to see anything. Walking in from afar, Kevin tries to ask if Jessica would like to change her living situation. The girl, clearly stunned by such a bold and direct question, just doesn't know what to answer. The doctor continues his monologue, saying that he should have confessed his feelings earlier because he has liked Jessica for a long time. Kevin grabs her hand and looks straight into her eyes and asks if she will go on a date with him. A blushing Jessica tries to explain that all this is very unexpected and that she is not mentally prepared for this. The doctor says that even if he isn't chosen as a partner, she definitely shouldn't get involved with the vampire hunter. Christopher, who appears out of nowhere, immediately decides to ask why he can't become Jessica's boyfriend. Unexpectedly for the doctor and nurse in the room, they turn around to find out how he ended up here. Kevin says that Christopher knows better than him why they can't be together and what this could mean. Our protagonist assures the doctor that he shouldn't worry about it and that he can figure it out himself. He grabs Jessica's hand and tries to take her away with him, saying that she is now his woman and he should stay away from her. After which the restless Jessica is brought in behind them, leaving all witnesses to this situation in complete bewilderment.